Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been trying to make sense of what happened to me for almost 10 years now. I'm not the type of guy who believes in monsters or gets spooked easily. I've spent most of my life outdoors, hunting since I was 12, worked forestry for a while, and I know the sounds animals make. But what I encountered back in November 2013 still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I'm Victor, 47 at the time this happened. I'd been hunting the same spot near the southern edge of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas for 6 seasons straight. It was off Route 88, in this beautiful stretch of dense woods that I knew like the back of my hand. Good deer population, plenty of fresh water, and usually peaceful. I'd spent countless nights there, sometimes alone, sometimes with my buddy Jeff. That particular trip, I was by myself. Jeff had come down with the flu, so I figured I'd do a solo trip, set up my usual spot, and spend a week hunting. Nothing unusual about that. I arrived around noon, got my camp set up, just a small tent, my cooler, and the basics. The weather forecast said we might get some light rain, but nothing major. Perfect hunting weather. The first day was completely normal. I saw a few deer, but nothing worth taking a shot at. I was hoping for that big 8-pointer I'd spotted last season, but never got a clean shot on. I made myself some dinner on my portable stove around 6. Just some beans and a can of chili, nothing fancy. By then, it was getting dark, and I could feel that light rain starting to come down. I was sitting by my small fire, just relaxing and planning where I'd set up in the morning, when it happened. It was exactly 7:45. I remember checking my watch right before. The sound came from about 50 yards away, somewhere beyond the tree line to the east of my camp. At first, I thought it was a woman. I swear to God, it sounded like someone shouting the word "you." But before the sound even finished, it changed. It morphed into this deep, thunderous roar that seemed to roll through the entire forest. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It wasn't a mountain lion. I've heard those plenty of times. It wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk, wasn't any animal I recognized from all my years outdoors. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, just listening. Then it happened again. The same exact pattern. A scream that started human-like, but transformed into that ungodly roar, followed by 3 deep, guttural grunts, like something massive catching its breath. Then a third time, the same pattern. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. You know, some local kids playing a prank on the out-of-towner. So I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice sounded pathetically small after that roar. No response. Just the patter of rain on the leaves. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The beam only penetrated about 20 feet into the darkness, nothing visible. I decided to make some noise. I grabbed my axe and shovel and clanged them together a few times. I figured if it was an animal, that would scare it off. If it was people, they'd know I was onto them. That's when I heard it start moving, not walking but jogging. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the trees, bipedal footsteps, 2 feet, not 4, breaking branches, pushing through underbrush, and moving with purpose. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I panicked. I grabbed my rifle and my sidearm, a Glock 20 I always carry as backup, and I backpedaled to my truck. I didn't run. I was too afraid to turn my back on whatever was out there. I kept my eyes and the flashlight beam trained on the direction of the sound as I moved. I reached my truck, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I turned on the headlights, pointing them toward where I'd heard the movement. I also grabbed my phone and turned on the video recorder, thinking maybe I could capture something. For hours I sat there in my truck, switching between watching the woods and checking the video playback. The headlights only showed rain-soaked trees swaying in the light breeze. The video captured nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional tap of rain on the truck roof. But I could still hear it out there, moving around the perimeter of where my lights reached, never coming into view. Sometimes it would go quiet for 20 or 30 minutes, and I'd start to think maybe it had left. Then I'd hear a branch snap or that heavy footfall again and realize it was still there, still circling, still watching. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that vocalization again, that same "you" sound transforming into a roar. But this time it was further away, maybe 100 yards or more. Then another one answered it from the opposite direction. There were at least 2 of them. I'm not religious, but I found myself praying for daylight. I kept both guns on my lap, doors locked, engine running so I could take off if needed. I didn't sleep a wink. When the first grey light of dawn finally came around 6:30, the woods were silent. I waited another hour until it was fully light before I ventured out of the truck. Part of me wanted to just drive away and never look back, but I needed to know if there was any evidence of what I'd heard. I approached my campsite cautiously, guns ready. Everything looked undisturbed. My tent was still up, cooler untouched. The fire had gone out hours ago. I walked the perimeter of my camp, looking for tracks or signs. The rain had softened the ground, but most of the forest floor was covered in leaves and pine needles, which made tracking difficult. I found a few broken branches and disturbed areas where something had definitely moved through, but nothing conclusive. No clear footprints, no hair samples, nothing I could point to and say, "This proves what I heard." I spent about an hour looking, then made a decision. I wasn't staying there another night. I packed up my camp, loaded everything into my truck, and relocated about 10 miles north to a spot near a lake I'd used in previous seasons. It was closer to the road, closer to other people. The rest of my hunting trip was uneventful. I didn't hear those sounds again. I didn't even see many deer. It's like the whole forest had gone quiet. When I got back to civilization, I tried to research what I might have heard. I looked up every animal native to Arkansas, listened to audio recordings of their calls. Nothing matched. I even found some recordings of what people claim are Bigfoot calls. Some had similarities, but nothing that matched exactly what I heard. That transformation from a human-sounding vocalization to that thunderous roar, I've never found anything that explains it. What bothers me most, even now, is that whatever made those sounds wasn't trying to avoid me. It wasn't scared off by my noise. It seemed to be announcing itself, letting me know it was there. And then, circling, watching, waiting. For what, I don't know, and I'm glad I didn't find out. I've been back to the Ouachita Mountains since then, but never to that exact spot. I still hunt, still camp, but I always bring someone with me now. And I always keep my truck keys in my pocket and my guns within reach. The thing is, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what I experienced. I was stone cold sober, fully alert, and what I heard was real. What it was, I still can't say. But something was out there in those Arkansas woods that night. Something that knew I was there. Something that wanted me to know it was there too. I've spent my whole life in the outdoors. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, all sorts of wildlife. Nothing has ever made me feel the way I felt that night, like I was being hunted, or at least assessed. Like I was in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I'll be drifting off to sleep and I'll hear it again in my mind, that "you" sound morphing into that ungodly roar. And I'll snap wide awake, heart pounding, ears straining to hear if it's real or just memory. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know if it was some undiscovered animal or something else entirely. All I know is that I heard it, it was real, and it was deliberately letting me know it was there. And whatever it was walking on 2 legs, not 4. Maybe someday I'll get an explanation that makes sense. Until then, I keep my hunting trips to areas with more people around, and I never, ever stay in those woods alone after dark anymore. Story 2. I've never told this story to many people. Even now, 52 years later, I get a strange feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I was just 10 years old in 1971, living with my parents on our property in Mendocino County, California. Our land overlooked the South Fork of the Eel River, and I spent most of my summer days exploring the woods and watching wildlife. My dad had given me a pair of binoculars for my birthday that year. Nothing fancy, just standard 7x35s, but to me, they were magical. They opened up a whole world I couldn't see with my naked eye. It was early August, one of those scorching days where the temperature hit the mid-90s by noon. School was still a few weeks away, and I had the entire day to myself. My parents were busy with chores around the property, so after lunch, I grabbed my binoculars and headed to my favorite spot, a small clearing near the edge of our property that had a perfect view of the northern bank across the river. I remember everything about that day with a clarity that's almost unsettling. The air was thick with heat, and cicadas were making that droning sound that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. I was wearing my favorite red t-shirt and those denim shorts my mum had cut from an old pair of jeans. My sneakers were caked with dirt from earlier adventures. I settled into my usual spot around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still high, bathing everything in bright light. Through my binoculars, I spotted a small herd of wild hogs rooting around near the tree line on the opposite bank. I loved watching them. The way the adults would methodically tear up the ground while the little ones scampered around. I must have been watching them for about 15 minutes when something caught my eye. There was movement higher up on the northern bank, maybe 100 yards from the hogs. At first I thought it was just a hiker. Our area wasn't exactly crowded, but occasionally people would come through, especially in summer. I adjusted my binoculars to focus on this new figure. What I saw didn't make sense at first. It looked like a man in a fur coat walking across a meadow. The meadow wasn't very big, maybe 40 yards across, but what struck me immediately was how wrong this picture was. Who wears a fur coat in August, in 95-degree heat? That was my first thought. My second thought was about how this person moved. Even at 10, I knew how people walked in rough terrain. My dad and I hiked all the time. In uneven ground, you step carefully, sometimes stumble, adjust your balance. But this figure moved with a smoothness that didn't look right. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but gliding across the landscape like it weighed nothing, despite its size. No stumbling, no hesitation, just this fluid, purposeful stride that covered ground faster than seemed possible. I remember my hands starting to sweat on the binoculars. I wiped them on my shorts and looked again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was crossing the meadow at an angle, heading toward a denser part of the forest. As it moved, sunlight hit it directly, and I could see that what I thought was a fur coat was actually covering its entire body. It wasn't a person wearing fur, it was fur. Reddish-brown, like the color of a cedar tree's bark, but with hints of auburn where the sun caught it. My breath got stuck somewhere in my chest. The creature was about 6 feet tall, not massive, but definitely bigger than me or any of my friends. It had long arms that swung in rhythm with its stride, and its head sat directly on broad shoulders with barely any neck visible. Its head was shaped like a rounded cone, not quite human, but not like any animal I'd seen either. I remember thinking, that's not a bear. I knew bears. We saw black bears in our area sometimes, and I knew how they moved. This wasn't a bear walking on hind legs. This was something else entirely. The wild hogs hadn't noticed it yet, but as the creature approached the far edge of the meadow, something changed. The hogs suddenly froze, then scattered in panic, disappearing into the underbrush. The creature didn't chase them or even acknowledge them. It just continued its purposeful walk toward the tree line. Just before it reached the forest edge, it stopped. My heart nearly stopped too. In one fluid motion, it turned its head and seemed to look directly across the river, directly at me. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, even with the binoculars, but I had the overwhelming sensation of being seen, of being known. It wasn't a threatening feeling, just aware, like two beings acknowledging each other across a divide. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, without hurry, the creature turned and stepped into the forest, disappearing from view. I sat there frozen, the binoculars still pressed against my face, staring at the empty spot where it had been. My hands were shaking so badly that the image in the lenses bounced around. I finally lowered them and realized I'd been holding my breath. My t-shirt was stuck to my back with sweat. That had nothing to do with the heat. I don't remember running back to the house, but I must have, because the next thing I recall is bursting through the back door, startling my mom, who was preparing dinner. She took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I tried to explain what I'd seen, the words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. There was a person, but not a person, covered in red-brown fur, walking like nothing I've ever seen before. My mom exchanged a look with my dad, who had just come in from the garage. That look adults give each other when they think a kid is making up stories. My dad sat me down at the kitchen table and got me a glass of water. "Now, Tommy," he said calmly, "tell us exactly what you saw. No embellishments." I described everything in detail, the size, the color, the impossible smooth way it moved across rough ground, how it seemed to notice me from that distance. As I spoke, I saw my parents' expressions change from skepticism to something else. Not exactly belief, but not dismissal either. "Have you ever heard of anyone seeing something like this around here?" my dad finally asked my mom. She hesitated. "The Wilsons' oldest boy mentioned something last summer about seeing a wild man up near Rattlesnake Creek. Everyone thought he was trying to scare the younger kids." My dad nodded slowly. "Tommy, I believe you saw something. I'm not saying I know what it was, but I believe you saw something that scared you." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure turning to look at me. I kept my window shut tight despite the heat, straining to hear any unusual sounds from the forest. The next morning, my dad went with me back to my observation spot, and we both scanned the opposite bank with binoculars for nearly an hour. We saw nothing unusual. "Maybe it was just passing through," my dad suggested, but his voice had an edge to it, and he kept one hand on my shoulder the whole time we were out there. It wasn't until weeks later, when school started, that I first heard the word Bigfoot from a classmate who had a book about mysterious creatures. The simple line drawing in the book sent a jolt through me. It matched what I had seen, though the proportions weren't quite right. In the drawing, the creature was massive, closer to 8 feet tall, with an exaggerated ape-like face. What I had seen was smaller, I don't know how to describe it except to say more elegant in its movements. As I grew older, I became almost obsessed with researching similar sightings. I read every book I could find, later searched internet forums, and even joined a couple of local groups that investigated reported encounters. Most of what I found described creatures much larger than what I had seen, giants of 7 to 9 feet. But occasionally, I'd come across accounts of smaller individuals, around 6 feet tall, often theorized to be females or adolescents of the species. What makes my sighting different from many others, I think, is the circumstances. It wasn't a fleeting glimpse in the dark or a shadowy figure at the edge of vision. It was 4 in the afternoon in bright August sunlight, observed through binoculars that gave me a clear, steady view for several minutes. I saw it walk across an entire meadow, watched how it moved, saw how the light played on its fur. I've told this story to wildlife biologists, to skeptics, to believers. Some dismiss me immediately. I was just a kid with an active imagination, they say. Others suggest I saw a bear or a human hunter in camouflage. But I know what bears look like through binoculars. I know what humans look like. This was neither. I'm 62 now, and I've never seen anything like it again, despite returning to those woods countless times over the years. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my 10-year-old mind somehow conjured this creature out of the heat and shadows of that August day. But then I remember the wild hogs scattering in fear. I remember the weight of what I felt when it turned and seemed to look at me. Those weren't imagined. Whatever I saw that day changed me. It opened a door in my mind to the possibility that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we allow ourselves to believe. Not in a fantastical way. I don't believe in monsters or magic, but in the sense that there are perhaps living things still undocumented, still moving through the wild places just beyond our regular perception. I still have those binoculars. They sit on my desk as I write this. Sometimes, when I hold them, I can almost feel the weight of that moment again, the catch of breath, the racing heart, the certainty that I was seeing something impossible. And I wonder if, somewhere in the forests of Northern California, that creature or its descendants are still there, still moving with that impossible grace across meadows in the heat of summer afternoons. Story 3. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or anything supernatural. 2 tours in Iraq will ground you in reality pretty damn quick. But what happened to me and my buddy Jason last October in the Idaho backcountry? I still can't explain it. I'm only writing this now because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. Jason and I go way back. We served together in the Marines, did 2 combat deployments in Fallujah. The kind of shit we saw over there bonds you for life. When we both got out in 2015, we made a pact to do an annual hunting trip together. Last fall was our 5th trip, elk hunting in southeastern Idaho, in some seriously remote wilderness near the Wyoming border. We'd been planning it for months. Jason flew in from North Carolina, and I drove up from Salt Lake. We met at this little podunk gas station near the trailhead, loaded up our gear, and headed out at first. Light. The plan was to ride about 12 miles into the backcountry on horseback. I had my gelding Thunder. Jason rode a mare named Daisy that I borrowed from my neighbor, and we had this old mule named Buster carrying most of our gear. The ride in was gorgeous. Tall pines, aspen groves with their leaves turning gold, and these massive rock formations jutting up everywhere. By mid-afternoon, we reached this perfect little meadow next to a creek. Great spot for base camp, water source, flat ground for the tent, and trees to tie up the animals. But something felt off. The horses were acting skittish from the moment we started setting up. Thunder kept snorting and pawing at the ground, which wasn't like him at all. He's normally bomb-proof. The mule wasn't much better, constantly swiveling his ears and refusing to settle. I figured maybe they were picking up the scent of a mountain lion or something. "The animals are spooked," I told Jason as we were setting up the tent. He just shrugged. "Probably just elk nearby. That's what we're here for, right?" We got everything set up, ate some freeze-dried chili, and turned in early since we planned to be up before dawn. Neither of us slept great. The horses were restless all night, and there was this weird silence. Anyone who spent time in the wilderness knows it's never actually silent. There's always something. Wind in the trees, animals moving around, insects buzzing. But that night, it was like everything was holding its breath. The next morning, we saddled up at first light and rode about 3 more miles to this ridge that overlooked a valley. Perfect elk country. We tied the horses to some trees about 50 yards back from the ridge and spent the day glassing for elk. That's when I first got the feeling we were being watched. It started as just a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind of 6th sense you develop in combat zones. I mentioned it to Jason, and he got real quiet, scanning the tree line with his binoculars. "I feel it too," he finally admitted. "Been feeling it for the last hour. We were both combat vets. We don't spook easy." But something about that feeling had us both on edge. Still, we tried to focus on hunting. Around mid-afternoon, We spotted a small herd of elk about 800 yards away, but they were moving away from us. No shot worth taking. As the day went on, the feeling of being watched intensified. By late afternoon, I was having trouble concentrating on anything else. The hair on my arms was standing up, and I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. "We should head back," Jason said around 4 o'clock. "Be dark in a couple hours, and I don't want to be navigating these trails at night." I nodded, relieved he'd suggested it first. We packed up our gear and headed back to where we'd left the horses. That's when things started getting really weird. The horses were absolutely frantic. Thunder was pulling at his lead rope so hard I thought he might break it. Daisy was wide-eyed, nostrils flaring. Both of them were covered in sweat despite the cool October air. "Whoa, easy boy," I said, trying to calm Thunder down. But he wasn't having it. His eyes were rolling, showing white all around. "Something's got them spooked bad," Jason said, struggling with Daisy. We managed to get mounted, but the horses were still jittery, prancing sideways and refusing to stand still. We started making our way back toward camp, and I noticed the forest had gone completely silent again. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of our horses' hooves on the trail and their nervous snorting. We'd been riding for maybe 20 minutes when the smell hit us. At first, I thought it might be an elk. It was musky and wild, but there was something wrong about it. Too strong, too pungent. Almost like something rotting, but not quite. It made my eyes water. "You smell that?" I asked Jason. He nodded, his face tense. "What the hell is that?" And then we heard it, the scream. I've heard elk bugle, bears roar, mountain lions screech. This wasn't like any of those. It started as a deep, guttural growl that rose into a high-pitched howl before ending in something that sounded almost human. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The horses lost it. Thunder reared up so violently I couldn't stay on. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. Through watering eyes, I saw Daisy bolt down the trail with Jason barely hanging on. Thunder followed right after, leaving me sprawled in the dirt. Jason managed to kick free of the stirrups before Daisy threw him about 50 yards further down the trail. I heard him curse as he landed. "Derek, you okay?" he called. "Yeah," I gasped, finally getting my breath back. "You?" "Think I twisted my ankle, but I'll live." I got to my feet, scanning the forest around us. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the trees. My rifle was still in its scabbard on Thunder, who was now God knows where. All I had was my sidearm, a semi-automatic 10mm I always carry in bear country. Jason limped over to me, his rifle still slung across his back. At least he hadn't lost his weapon. "What the fuck was that?" he whispered, eyes darting around the forest. I shook my head. "No idea. But the horses are headed back to camp. We should follow." "If we can find it before dark," Jason said, looking up at the darkening sky. We both knew what he wasn't saying. We were about 2 miles from camp, in increasingly poor light, with something unknown in the woods with us. We started moving, falling naturally into the patrol formation we'd used hundreds of times in Iraq. Back to back, Jason limping but still covering his sectors, me with my pistol drawn. Every few steps, we'd pause and listen. The forest remained eerily silent for about 10 minutes. Then we heard it again, that same ungodly scream, but closer this time. Maybe 75 yards away. "Fuck," Jason muttered, raising his rifle. "Keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Camp's that way." We picked up the pace as much as Jason's ankle would allow. The light was fading fast now, the shadows between the trees deepening into impenetrable darkness. And then we heard something else, a series of whoops and hollers, almost like someone trying to mimic an owl but getting it wrong. "That's not an animal," Jason whispered. "No," I agreed. "Sounds almost like someone's trying to communicate." The calls continued, moving around us in a way that suggested multiple sources, sometimes from our left, sometimes from our right, occasionally from behind us, never from the direction of camp. "They're trying to herd us," Jason said, his voice tight. The tactical implications weren't lost on either of us. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just randomly making noise, it was coordinating. By now, it was almost fully dark. I clicked on my small flashlight, keeping the beam pointed at the ground in front of us. We continued to move, step by careful step, toward where we thought camp was. The vocalizations continued, getting closer, and then we heard rocks being struck together, sharp, deliberate cracks that echoed through the trees. I'd never heard of any animal that could make a sound like that. "We need to find a defensible position," Jason said. "We're not gonna make it to camp tonight." He was right. Moving through the forest in the dark with something stalking us was suicide. We found a small clearing with a fallen log on one side and positioned ourselves with our backs to the log, giving us a 180-degree view of the approach. And there we sat, for what felt like the longest night of my life. The moon rose, casting just enough light to see vague shapes between the trees. The vocalizations continued intermittently, sometimes so close I swear whatever was making them couldn't have been more than 50 feet away. But we never saw anything. Clearly, just shadows moving between the trees, glimpses of something large that would vanish as soon as I tried to focus on it. Around midnight, we heard crashing sounds from the direction of our camp, like something was ransacking it. I thought of poor Buster, tied up and unable to escape. "What the hell are these things?" Jason whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. I don't fucking know." We'd both seen combat. We'd been shot at, mortared, and IED'd. But something about this situation was worse. In Iraq, we knew who the enemy was. We understood the threat. This was completely outside our experience. The night dragged on endlessly. Neither of us slept. We'd take turns standing watch while the other rested, but rest was impossible with the constant noises surrounding us. That horrible scream would rip through the night at random intervals, sometimes answered by those strange whooping calls from different directions. When the first hint of dawn finally appeared, the noises gradually faded away. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, we made our way back to camp, moving cautiously, weapons ready. What we found was a mess. Our tent had been shredded, the contents of our packs strewn everywhere. But strangely, none of our food had been touched, not even the jerky that would tempt any bear. Buster was still there, wide-eyed and trembling, his lead rope stretched tight as he tried to get as far from the forest as possible, but no sign of Thunder or Daisy. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jason said, surveying the destruction. I couldn't agree more. We hastily packed what we could salvage onto Buster, abandoning the rest. Then we started the long 12-mile hike back to the trailhead, taking turns leading the still spooked mule. We didn't talk much during that hike. What was there to say? Nothing in our experience could explain what had happened. We kept our weapons ready and our eyes on the forest, but whatever had terrorized us through the night seemed to have vanished with the dawn. When we finally reached the trailhead around mid-afternoon, we got the only piece of good news that whole trip. Thunder and Daisy were there, still saddled, grazing peacefully near our truck and trailer. Somehow, they'd found their way back on their own. Jason and I have talked about that night many times since then. We've gone over every detail, tried to rationalize what happened. Could it have been bears, mountain lions, other hunters messing with us? None of the explanations fit what we experienced. All I know is that I'll never go back to those woods again. And sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I still hear that scream echoing in my head. That horrible sound that was neither fully animal nor human, but somehow both. Story 4. I've been hunting all my life. Started when I was just a kid with my dad and uncles in the backwoods of Morton County. But what happened that night in October 2008 near Burr Oak Lake? I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've never told this story outside our small group because honestly, people would think we were drunk or making it up. We weren't. It was supposed to be a regular coon hunting night. Me, Joe, my brother Dave, and our buddies Mike, Travis, and Rick had been planning this trip for weeks. The 5 of us had been hunting together for years. We all grew up around these parts and knew those woods like the backs of our hands. Or at least we thought we did. We met up at my place around 7 in the evening. The air had that perfect October chill, not too cold but crisp enough that you could see your breath if you exhaled hard. The kind of night raccoons love to be out and about. Dave brought his famous beef jerky, Mike had some sandwiches, and Travis packed enough coffee to keep an army awake. Rick was running late as usual, but we waited because he had 2 of the dogs with him. Our dogs were the best around for coon hunting. I had my blue tick, Rusty, who'd been with me for 6 years. Dave's redbone, Sadie, was young but promising. Mike had his walker, Duke, and Rick was bringing his 2 black and tans, Buster and Scout. These dogs weren't just pets, they were working animals, trained since they were pups to track and tree raccoons. We'd spent countless hours working with them, and they'd never let us down. When Rick finally showed up, we loaded everything into our trucks and headed out to East Branch Road, our usual starting point. It borders some state land that runs along Burr Oak Lake. We'd hunted there dozens of times without issue. We parked our trucks at the end of East Branch, where it turns to gravel. There was no one else around, not unusual for a weeknight in October. The moon was nearly full, giving us decent visibility even before we turned on our headlamps. The plan was simple. Release the dogs, let them pick up a scent, and follow them when they started barking on a trail. "Weather's perfect tonight," Travis said as he let Duke out of the truck. "Bet we get at least 3 or 4. "Long as Rick doesn't get us lost again," Dave joked, earning a middle finger from Rick. "That was one time," Rick shot back, "and it was foggy as hell." We all laughed, completely unaware of what was about to happen. We released all 5 dogs around 8:30. They took off into the woods, noses to the ground, tails wagging. We could hear them rustling through the underbrush, getting farther away. This was always my favorite part, standing in the dark, listening to the dogs work, waiting for that first excited bark that meant they'd found something. It didn't take long. Maybe 15 minutes later, Rusty let out his distinctive howl, followed quickly by the others. They'd picked up a trail. We could tell from the pattern of barks that they were moving fast, heading deeper into the woods toward the lake. "Sounds like they're onto something good," Mike said, grabbing his pack. "Let's go." We turned on our headlamps and started following the sound of the dogs. We weren't in any rush. The dogs would tree the raccoon and keep barking until we got there. The barking got more intense, which told us they were closing in on their target. They were maybe half a mile ahead of us in the direction of an area with some bigger trees near a small creek that feeds into Burr Oak. Then it happened. The dogs barking suddenly got frantic. Not their usual "we've treed something" bark, but agitated, almost panicked. And then, cutting through the night like a knife, came this scream. I've heard bobcats, I've heard foxes, I've heard injured deer and wild hogs, and just about everything else these woods have to offer. This wasn't any of those. It was loud. Jesus, it was loud. And it couldn't have been more than 100 yards from where we stood. It started low and rose to this pitch that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was almost human, but not quite. Too powerful, too wild. We all froze. Nobody said a word. We just stood there, 5 grown men suddenly terrified in woods we'd known all our lives. Then came another sound, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't directed at us. It was aimed at our dogs. I know that sounds crazy, but there was intent behind it, like whatever made that sound was communicating. And then the most chilling thing of all happened. Our dogs went completely silent. Not gradually, not one by one. All 5 at once just stopped. No whimpering, no barking, nothing. Just dead silence in the woods. "What the fuck was that?" Travis whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again. That same scream, but closer this time. And something else, the sound of movement. Heavy movement, like something big pushing through the underbrush, coming in our direction. I'd like to say we were brave, that we stood our ground or went to find our dogs, but that would be a lie. We ran, all 5 of us without a word, turned and sprinted back toward the trucks. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I remember branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me up, but I just kept going. We piled into the trucks, not even caring whose was whose. I ended up in Rick's with Dave, while Mike and Travis jumped into mine. Rick's hands were shaking so bad he could barely get the key in the ignition. "The dogs," Dave said, breathing hard. "We can't just leave them." "You want to go back out there?" Rick snapped, finally getting the engine started. None of us did. Not then. So we drove, fast, back to my place. Nobody spoke much on the ride. What was there to say? We'd all heard it. We'd all felt the same primal fear. When we got back, we sat in my kitchen drinking beer and trying to make sense of what had happened. Travis suggested a bear, but there hadn't been confirmed bear sightings in that area for years. Mike thought maybe some kind of big cat, but it didn't sound like any mountain lion or bobcat we'd ever heard. "Whatever it was," Dave said quietly, "the dogs knew to shut up and hide." That's when the guilt really hit us. Our dogs were still out there with that thing. Rusty had a GPS tracking collar on him. We used them to find the dogs when they ranged too far, but I hadn't even thought to check it in our panic. I pulled out my receiver and turned it on. The signal was weak but present. Rusty was alive at least, and not moving much. He was about 2 miles from where we'd been, in the direction of the road that runs along the north side of the hunting area. "We have to go back for them," I said. "First light." Everyone agreed, though nobody looked happy about it. We decided to crash at my place for what was left of the night, though I don't think any of us slept much. I know I didn't. I kept hearing that scream in my head, trying to match it to something, anything I knew. But I couldn't. As soon as the skies started to lighten around 6 in the morning, we loaded up and headed back. Nobody wanted to go, but we couldn't leave our dogs. We brought our rifles this time, not just the small caliber ones we'd use for raccoons, but our deer rifles, just in case. We parked at a different spot, closer to where Rusty's signal was coming from. It was a bridge over one of the streams that feeds into Burr Oak, on that north road I mentioned. The signal showed Rusty was somewhere under or near that bridge. We approached cautiously, calling the dogs' names softly. No response. The bridge was small, just a single-lane concrete span about 15 feet long. There's a space underneath, maybe 4 feet high, where the water flows through, with some dry ground on either side of the stream. Dave was the first to kneel down and shine his flashlight under there. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. I got down next to him and looked. There they were, all 5 dogs huddled together in the farthest, darkest corner under the bridge. They were alive, but completely terrified. Rusty, who normally would come bounding over at the sound of my voice, didn't even look up. He was pressed against the concrete wall, shivering, with Sadie basically in his lap. The other 3 were piled around them, all pressed together as tightly as they could get. "Hey, Rusty. Hey, boy," I called softly. His ears twitched, but that was it. We had to crawl under there and physically pull each dog out. They didn't resist, but they didn't help either. It was like they were in shock. When we finally got them all out into the daylight, we could see they weren't injured. No blood, no visible wounds, but something had broken inside them. These confident, skilled hunting dogs had been reduced to shivering, traumatized shadows of themselves. We loaded them into the trucks and took them straight to Doc Wilson, the vet in McConnellsville who's treated our animals for years. He checked them over and confirmed what we could see. Physically, they were fine. No injuries, except some minor scratches from running through brush. "What happened to them?" he asked, looking genuinely puzzled as Buster cringed away from his gentle touch. We exchanged glances. How could we explain? Something scared them in the woods, Mike finally said. We heard something. They ran off. Doc Wilson raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He gave them some mild sedatives and suggested we keep them quiet for a few days. It took weeks for the dogs to recover. Rusty wouldn't go more than a few feet from my side for days. Wouldn't eat unless I was sitting right next to him. Sadie was young enough that she eventually bounced back almost completely. But the others, they were never the same as hunters. Buster and Scout eventually adjusted enough to be good yard dogs, but they would panic at the mere suggestion of going into those woods again. Duke had to be rehomed to Mike's cousin in Columbus, a complete city dog now, living out his days chasing tennis balls in a fenced backyard. As for us humans, we never went back to that specific area. We still hunt, but further west, away from Burr Oak. We don't talk about that night much, even among ourselves. What would we say? That something in those familiar woods screamed at our dogs and scared the living daylights out of 5 grown men. That whatever it was communicated somehow, telling our highly trained hunting dogs to shut up and hide. I've spent 15 years wondering what was in those woods that night. I've researched every animal native to Ohio, listened to countless audio recordings of known predators. Nothing matches. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see. But then I remember the look in Rusty's eyes when we pulled him from under that bridge, and I know I never will. Whatever it was, it owns those woods now, at least in my mind. Story 5. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my close circle, but it's been over 20 years now, and I still can't make sense of what happened that night. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar, or has some insight. It was early October 1998. I was in my junior year at USC, and a bunch of us had planned a weekend camping trip along Thompson River in South Carolina. I'd grown up fishing those waters with my dad, so I volunteered to guide everyone to this sweet spot I knew about, where the catfish practically jumped onto your hook. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, my roommate Jake, and our friends Mike and Chris. We could have driven most of the way there, but I suggested hiking in instead. The fall weather was perfect, crisp, cool air, leaves just starting to turn. The trail would take us about 4 hours, but I promised them the fishing would be worth it. We set out early Saturday morning, loaded with our gear. The hike was challenging enough to keep conversation light, with plenty of breaks to drink water and adjust our packs. I remember feeling so at peace as we walked through those woods. It's weird how vivid that feeling is now, knowing how things would change in just a few hours. We reached the spot around 2 in the afternoon. It was exactly as I remembered. A gentle bend in the river, with a small clearing perfect for camping. Someone had already made a fire pit with stones, which was convenient. The water was calm and clear, and you could see fish darting around in the deeper pools. "Dude, this is awesome," Jake said, immediately dropping his pack and reaching for his fishing rod. The others followed suit, and within minutes we were all casting lines into the river. The fishing was as good as I'd promised. By sunset, we had enough catfish for a feast. We cleaned them right there by the river and carried them back to camp. Mike got a fire going while Chris set up the small portable grill we'd lugged in. It was around 7 o'clock when we finally sat down to eat. Passing around beers from our cooler and swapping stories. That's when we heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A high-pitched sound, almost like a child crying, coming from the ridge about 200 yards above our campsite. I paused mid-sentence, and Jake looked at me. "What was that?" he asked. "Probably just a bobcat," I said, trying to sound confident. They can sound weirdly human sometimes. The others seemed satisfied with this explanation, and we went back to eating. But then, about 2 minutes later, we heard it again. The same crying sound, but slightly different location, like whatever was making it had moved along the ridge. "That's one mobile bobcat," Chris muttered, looking uneasy. For the next 20 minutes, the sound continued, always about 2 minutes apart, always from a slightly different spot. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. What had been a relaxing evening now felt tense. We cleaned up dinner and added more wood to the fire, unconsciously building it higher than necessary. It was around 10 o'clock when the next weird thing happened. We were sitting around the fire talking about classes and girls and normal college stuff when something landed in our campsite with a dull thud. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the night, it was startling. Mike grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate. "It's just a rock," he called back, holding up a smooth river stone about the size of a golf ball. "Probably fell from somewhere," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it made no sense. We were on flat ground, and the nearest slope was that ridge where we'd heard the crying. Before we could discuss it further, another stone landed about 10 feet away from the first. Then another, and another. They were coming from different directions, but none larger than a quarter-sized pebble. They weren't being thrown hard enough to hurt if they hit us, but the precision was unnerving, landing in our camp, but not directly hitting any of us. "Is someone fucking with us?" Jake stood up, shouting into the darkness. "This isn't funny." His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. Just another small stone landing near the edge of our firelight. I went to my pack and retrieved my 9mm pistol. I'd brought it mainly for snakes or if we encountered an aggressive animal. But now I was glad to have it for different reasons. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring. "Listen up!" I called out, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "I'm armed! If you're trying to scare us, it's not funny!" The stone throwing stopped immediately after that. We all looked at each other, relieved but confused. "Maybe it was just some local kids messing with us," Chris suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided to take shifts staying awake. I volunteered for the first watch, while the others tried to get some sleep in our 2 tents. I sat by the fire, pistol in my lap, straining to hear anything unusual over the crackling flames and the distant sound of the river. My watch passed uneventfully, and around midnight I woke Jake for his shift. I crawled into the tent, exhausted but still on edge. Despite my anxiety, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, Jake was shaking me awake. "Ryan," he whispered urgently, "it's back." It was around 4:30 in the morning. I grabbed my gun and crawled out of the tent. The fire had died down to embers, casting an eerie red glow over our campsite. Jake pointed toward the ridge. "The crying started again about 5 minutes ago," he said, "but now there's something else." As if on cue, we heard it. 3 distinct knocks, loud and deliberate, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a heavy stick. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the valley. Chris and Mike emerged from the other tent, looking as scared as I felt. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." We huddled together by the fire, adding more wood to build it back up. The crying sound continued, but now it was coming from the opposite direction of the knocking. Every 10 minutes, like clockwork, the knocking would repeat. 3 clear, distinct sounds. Then more crying, moving around, never from the same spot twice. "There's more than one," Chris said, voicing what we were all thinking. The sounds continued until the first hint of dawn appeared in the sky. As the darkness receded, the noises finally stopped. We looked at each other, exhausted and frightened. None of us had slept more than a couple of hours. "Let's get the hell out of here," Jake said. No one argued. We packed up camp in record time, not even bothering with breakfast. The plan was to fish our way back to the road, moving downstream along the river. We'd be back at the car by early afternoon. About an hour into our hike, we came across something strange. There was an area about 50 yards from the river where the ground had been absolutely destroyed, like something had been digging and thrashing around. The soil was torn up, exposing roots and rocks. Scattered around were several large piles of scat, concentrated mainly around 2 white oak trees. I'd been hunting enough with my dad to recognize animal sign, but this was different. The scat was too large for a deer or fox, and the destruction too deliberate for a bear looking for grubs. Something had been marking territory. "Let's move faster," I said, not wanting to examine it too closely. The rest of our hike was a blur. We barely stopped to rest, let alone fish. When we finally reached my Jeep parked at the trailhead, it was just past noon. The relief of seeing that vehicle, of knowing we were about to return to civilization, was overwhelming. On the drive back to campus, we tried to make sense of what had happened. The crying sounds could have been an animal, maybe a fox or a bobcat. The knocking could have been a woodpecker or branches hitting together in the wind. The stones, well, that was harder to explain away. Maybe there had been people messing with us after all. But deep down, I knew better. The coordination of it all, the strategic positioning of sounds from multiple directions, the rhythmic knocking, the stone throwing that started and stopped with such precision, it suggested intelligence. Whatever had stalked us that night wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. Years later, I came across local legends about something called the Long Creek Monster, said to roam the wilderness along Thompson River. The descriptions varied, but the behaviors matched what we experienced. Mimicking human sounds, throwing stones, knocking on trees. I never went back to that spot again. None of us did. We didn't talk about it much after that weekend, but sometimes, when Jake and I have a few beers, he'll look at me and say, "Remember that night on the river?" And I'll just nod, because some experiences don't need words. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that something was out there in those woods, something smart enough to surround us, to communicate, to toy with us through the longest night of my life. And sometimes, when I'm camping and hear an unusual sound in the darkness, I find myself holding my breath, listening for those 3 distinct knocks. I'll tell you, story 6. I've never really talked about this outside my family and a few close friends, but it's been almost 20 years now, and I still think about it all the time. I was 11 years old in the summer of 2004, living with my parents and younger brother in this little rural neighborhood just outside Morton, Washington. Our house wasn't anything special, just a single-story ranch-style place with a big yard backing up to some woods. That night in July started out completely normal. My parents had gone to bed early because my dad had to be up at 5 for work, and my brother was staying at a friend's house. Mom let me stay up late since it was summer break, so I was sitting in the living room watching some stupid reality show. The windows were all open because it had been really hot that day, and even though it had cooled down, the house was still stuffy. It must have been around 10 at night. I remember because the show I was watching was just ending, and I was deciding whether to go to bed or try to find something else to watch. Our living room had this big picture window that faced the front yard and the street beyond. The curtains were pulled back, and outside, it was that weird kind of dark you get in rural areas, not completely black because of the half moon, but dark enough that you couldn't make out details of things. I was just about to get up and head to my room when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a dog, like a really big dog making these deep grunting noises, but something about it immediately made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't continuous like a dog growling. It was rhythmic, almost like something breathing really heavily while moving, and it was getting louder, which meant whatever was making the noise was coming closer to our house. I remember sitting there completely frozen, not out of curiosity, but pure instinct. Something deep inside me was screaming, "Don't move." My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The grunting got closer and closer until it was right outside our front yard. Then I heard heavy footsteps, not like a person walking, but heavier, yet still with a weird rhythm that didn't sound like a 4-legged animal. I still hadn't moved from the couch, but I slowly turned my head toward the window. That's when I saw it pass by. I only caught a glimpse as it moved across our front yard, but that was enough. It was big, way bigger than any person I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was walking upright on 2 legs, but not like a human walks. Its movements were wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. It wasn't a bear standing up either. I'd seen bears at the wildlife sanctuary on a school trip, and this didn't move anything like that. The shape was broad, wide shoulders that tapered down, but bulky all over. It was dark, either covered in fur or hair. I couldn't tell in the moonlight, but what I could see was that its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees. I couldn't make out any features of its face, just a dark silhouette against the night sky. And then the smell hit me. God, that smell. It was the worst thing I've ever smelled in my life, like roadkill that had been sitting in the sun for days, mixed with something musky and wet, like soaked fur. It was so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. As it passed by our yard and continued down the street, every dog in the neighborhood went absolutely insane. We had lots of neighbors with dogs, and they all started barking at once. Not the normal barking when a deer walks by or someone comes home late. This was frantic, terrified barking. Some were howling, others sounded like they were trying to break out of their yards or houses. Our neighbor's German shepherd, who was usually this fierce guard dog, was making this high-pitched whining sound I'd never heard before. The whole thing lasted maybe 15 seconds. It just walked past our house and continued down the street, disappearing into the darkness. But those 15 seconds changed something in me forever. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes. I was too scared to move, too scared to get up and go tell my parents. I kept thinking that if I moved, somehow it would know and come back. Eventually, I got up the courage to run to my room. I shut the door, turned on all the lights, and hid under my blankets until morning. The next day, I tried to tell my parents about it. They listened, but I could tell they thought I was exaggerating or had fallen asleep on the couch and had a nightmare. My dad said it was probably just a bear, even though bears weren't common in our immediate area. My mum suggested it might have been a transient walking through the neighborhood. Neither explanation fit what I saw. But then our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, came over that afternoon. She was this older lady who lived alone about 3 houses down. She was talking to my mom in the kitchen, and I overheard her saying something about a strange creature that had walked through her backyard the night before. She described hearing the same grunting sounds I had heard, and said whatever it was had knocked over her garbage cans and left strange, large footprints in her garden. That's when I realized I wasn't crazy. Other people had seen or heard it too. Over the next few days, there was a buzz around the neighborhood. At least 4 other houses reported similar experiences, all describing the same tall, dark figure walking on 2 legs, the terrible smell, and how their pets had freaked out. Mr. Carlson, who lived at the end of our street, even took pictures of some weird tracks in the mud behind his shed. They looked kind of like bare human footprints, but way bigger and with the wrong number of toes. The local sheriff came out, looked around, and basically told everyone it was probably just a bear. But nobody believed him. Bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs for extended periods. And bears, while they can smell bad, don't have that distinctive rotting stench. The weirdest part was how quickly everyone stopped talking about it. It was like after a week or so, people just wanted to forget about it. Maybe it was too uncomfortable to think about what might really be living in the woods around us. My parents never brought it up again, and eventually I stopped talking about it too. But I never forgot. For years, I convinced myself that maybe I had exaggerated things in my mind. Maybe it was just a bear or some weird drifter passing through. I was just a kid after all. But then, when I was 16, something happened that brought it all rushing back. My brother Kyle, who's 3 years younger than me, was coming home from a friend's house one night. This was in 2009. He was taking this back road that cuts through some woods about 4 miles from our house. He came home white as a sheet, shaking. When my parents asked what was wrong, he described seeing something tall and dark cross the road about 50 feet in front of his car. He said it walked on two legs, but wasn't human. Too big, too wide, moving all wrong, and he mentioned the smell that filled his car, even with the windows up. Kyle had never really believed my story before. I'd told him about it a few times over the years, but he always laughed it off. That night he apologized for ever doubting me. Whatever I had seen walking past our house that night in 2004, he had seen it too, or something just like it. After that, we started doing some research. Turns out Lewis County has a long history of strange sightings in the woods. Most people don't talk about it openly. It's more like something people discuss in hushed tones at barbecues after a few beers. But we've met at least a dozen people over the years who have their own stories about encountering something tall, dark, and unnatural in the forests around Morton. I'm 29 now, and I've moved away from Morton, but I still visit my parents regularly. Every time I drive through those woods, especially at night, I find myself scanning the tree line. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement just beyond the reach of my headlights. And occasionally, when the windows are down, I'll catch a whiff of that unmistakable smell. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal. And whatever it was, it's still out there in those woods. Sometimes I wonder if it knows I saw it. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 7. I still remember that morning so vividly, February 23rd, 1995. It's been almost 30 years, but I can close my eyes and be right back there on Balm Road, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe too deep. The sky was just starting to lighten, that weird blue-gray winter dawn that makes everything look a little unreal. I was 24 back then, working construction in Canton, had to be on site by 7 every morning, so I was always up before the sun. That particular morning, I'd picked up my friend Melissa, who needed a ride to her nursing shift at Altman Hospital. She lived out past me, so it made sense to carpool. We'd known each other since high school, nothing romantic, just good friends. She was half asleep in my passenger seat, nursing a travel mug of coffee, probably regretting picking up that extra early shift. My old Ford Ranger rattled along Balm Road heading west, heater blasting but still not quite keeping up with the February chill. It was maybe 6:15, 6:20 in the morning. The road was empty except for us. That stretch of Stark County is pretty rural, fields, patches of woods, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. It's the kind of area where people say they've seen things, but I was never the type to believe those stories, not until that day. I've always been observant when I drive. My dad taught me to constantly scan, keep track of what's around me. There's this small pond about 30 yards off the north side of Balm Road that I'd pass every morning. I'd gotten into the habit of glancing at it because you'd often see deer coming down, to drink at dawn. Sometimes I'd count them just to pass the time, silly little morning ritual. So I'm driving, right? Going maybe 45 miles per hour. I do my usual glance toward the pond, expecting maybe to see a doe or two, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. There was this figure squatting at the water's edge, not standing fully upright, but in a deep crouch, balancing on the balls of its feet like it was comfortable that way. It was in front of some thick bushes that grew near the pond's edge, partially obscured but clearly visible in the growing dawn light. This wasn't a person. No way. It was massive, way bigger than any human I've ever seen. Had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall if it stood up straight, and it was covered head to toe in this dark fur, like a dark chocolate brown, almost black. The fur looked thick, matted in some places, especially around what I guess would be its shoulders. But what really got me, what really made my stomach drop, was how it was. Drinking. It had extended its right arm, and I need to be clear here, It wasn't a paw or a claw. It was a hand, a massive hairy hand with fingers scooping water up to what I assume was its mouth. The movement was so deliberate, so human, but nothing else about it was human at all. I only saw it for maybe 3-4 seconds tops as we drove past. The pond isn't that big, and at 45 miles per hour, you don't get a long look. But it was close enough to the road, maybe 30 yards away with no trees blocking my view. Just that perfect angle where the morning light hit it, and I could see everything clearly. I didn't swerve. I didn't slow down. Some part of my brain just kept my hands steady on the wheel, while another part was freaking the hell out. I remember my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My palms got instantly sweaty on the steering wheel. The weirdest part, I didn't say anything. Neither did Melissa. We just kept driving in complete silence. I kept waiting for her to say something, to scream, to ask if I'd seen that thing. But she was quiet, staring straight ahead now, no longer sleepy. I could see her hands gripping her coffee mug so tight her knuckles were white. I think we were both trying to process it, trying to convince ourselves we'd seen a bear, even though there aren't supposed to be bears in that part of Ohio. Or maybe a guy in a costume at 6 in the morning in February, or literally anything except what it actually looked like. We drove for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. The silence in the truck was suffocating. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Hey, did you see something back there? By that pond?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out strained. I didn't want to lead her or put ideas in her head. I wanted to know if she'd seen what I'd seen. She turned to me slowly, and I'll never forget the look on her face. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "You mean that thing crouched down by the water?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, my mouth dry. "What did it look like to you?" "It was huge," she said, "all covered in dark fur. It was scooping water with its hand, like a person would." She demonstrated the motion, her hand cupped as if gathering water. It hit me like a brick to the chest. She'd seen exactly what I had seen. The same posture, the same location, the same drinking action. There was no way we were both hallucinating the exact same thing. "Holy shit," I whispered. "That was real." "What was it?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. I couldn't bring myself to say the word. It sounded so ridiculous, like something from a tabloid or a late-night radio show. But what else could it have been? "I don't know," I lied, because I did know. We both did. The strange thing is, neither of us suggested turning back. Not once. Looking back now, that seems crazy. We'd just potentially seen something that would turn science on its head, proof of a creature most people think is just a myth, and we didn't even consider going back for a second look. But in that moment, there was this primal fear, this instinct that said, keep driving, don't stop, don't go back there. The rest of the drive was a blur. We talked about it non-stop, comparing what we'd seen, confirming details with each other. The height, the fur, the way it moved, the human-like hand. We weren't crazy. We hadn't imagined it. It was 100% real. I dropped Melissa at the hospital, and we promised to talk more later. I went to my construction job and somehow made it through the day, though I can't remember a single thing I did. My mind was completely occupied with what we'd seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing it in my mind, that massive figure crouched by the water. I started researching, reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings in Ohio. Turns out there have been hundreds of reports over the years, many in the eastern and southern parts of the state. Some of the descriptions matched exactly what we'd seen. The next morning, I drove back to the pond. In the light of day, with the sun high in the sky, it looked so ordinary. Just a small body of water surrounded by bushes and a few trees. I pulled over and got out, scanning the ground near the water's edge. The earth was still partially frozen, but there were areas of mud near the pond. I looked for tracks, for hair caught on branches, for any sign that what we'd seen was real and not some shared delusion. I didn't find anything conclusive. There were some odd depressions in the mud, but nothing clear enough that I could say for sure they were footprints. No broken branches, no tufts of fur. Nothing that would convince a skeptic, but I didn't need physical evidence anymore. What Melissa and I saw that morning was evidence enough for me. Two people, independently seeing the exact same thing with no suggestion or leading questions. That's about as reliable as eyewitness testimony gets. I've gone back to that pond dozens of times over the years, at different times of day, in different seasons. I've never seen it again. Sometimes I wonder if it was just passing through or if it normally stayed deeper in the woods and we just happened to catch it during a rare moment when it ventured closer to the road. I never reported it officially, didn't want to deal with the ridicule, the disbelief, the accusations of hoaxing or being attention-seeking. Melissa and I talked about it occasionally over the years, but we mostly kept it to ourselves. She moved to Columbus a few years later, and we lost touch. Sometimes I wonder if she still thinks about that morning as much as I do. Before that day, I was the biggest skeptic you'd ever meet. I'd roll my eyes at Bigfoot stories, at people claiming they'd seen UFOs or ghosts or whatever. I was the guy who needed hard proof, who believed only what science had verified and documented. Now, I'm not so sure about anything. That single moment, those few seconds driving past that pond, fundamentally changed how I see the world. It opened my mind to possibilities I'd dismissed my entire life. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I know how it sounds. If someone told me this story before 1995, I'd think they were lying or confused or saw a bear from a weird angle. But I know what I saw. Melissa knows what she saw. It was no bear, no man in a costume, no trick of the light or morning fog playing with our perception. There are things in this world we don't understand yet, things that live in the spaces between civilization, in the woods and mountains and wild places, things that mostly stay hidden. But sometimes, if you're in the right place at exactly the right moment, you might catch a glimpse of them. I don't drive Balm Road much anymore. My commute changed years ago when I switched jobs. But every once in a while I'll take the long way home, driving past that little pond just as the sun is coming up. I'll slow down a bit, scanning the water's edge, hoping for another glimpse. I never see anything but deer and the occasional heron, but I know what's out there, and nothing can ever make me unknow it. Story 8. I still can't explain what happened to us that day in July of 2015. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000,000 times, but I always end up with more questions than answers. It's been almost 9 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My buddy Eric and I have always been into exploring random places around Southwest Washington. We're not exactly urban explorers or anything that organized. We just like finding weird spots in the woods that most people don't know about. Old logging camps, abandoned structures, that kind of thing. That summer, we'd heard about this massive flooded quarry hidden deep in the woods near the southern edge of the Cascades. Neither of us had ever been there, but I managed to find it on some outdated satellite images after searching for hours. The images showed this perfect oval of black water surrounded by rocky cliffs. It looked incredible, like something you'd see in a travel magazine. We decided to make a day of it. I picked Eric up around 9 in the morning. We grabbed some sandwiches and energy drinks from the gas station and hit the road. The drive was about an hour and a half from Vancouver, mostly on these winding back roads that got progressively narrower until we were basically on a glorified logging path. When we got to where I thought we should park, we realized how much work this was actually going to be. There wasn't any trail, not even a hint of one, just thick, brutal underbrush stretching out in every direction. I remember Eric saying, "Dude, are you sure about this?" But I was determined to find this place. The hike was absolute hell. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was some of the worst bushwhacking I've ever done. The blackberry bushes were everywhere, tearing at our clothes and skin. Fallen trees blocked our path constantly, forcing us to either climb over them or find a way around. Every step was a struggle, and the July heat made everything 10 times worse. We were both drenched in sweat within 20 minutes. After about an hour of this torture, we started to doubt whether the quarry even existed. Our phones had zero service, and the GPS was acting weird in the dense forest. Just as we were considering turning back, the tree line suddenly opened up, and there it was. The quarry was massive, way bigger than it looked in the satellite images. It was probably 70 or 80 yards long and maybe 30 across, with steep cliff walls rising 40 to 80 feet on all sides. The water was pitch black and completely still, like a giant mirror reflecting the sky. It was beautiful, but also kind of eerie. There was something unsettling about how silent and perfect it was. We decided to walk around the rim to find a good spot to sit and maybe even swim if we got brave enough. That's when we heard it for the first time. About 20 yards away, somewhere in the thick brush, came this high-pitched screech that made my skin crawl. It's really hard to describe accurately, but it was like metal grinding on metal mixed with a scream, something between a pig being slaughtered and a rusty brake pad. It lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, then stopped. Eric and I both froze and looked at each other. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but my heart was already racing. We figured it was probably just some weird bird or maybe a fox. They can make some pretty strange sounds. We continued walking along the rim, but now we were both on edge. About 5 minutes later, we heard the screech again, still about 20 yards away, but now from a different direction. It seemed to be following our movement around the quarry. "Hey!" Eric shouted toward the sound. "Anyone there?" No response, just silence. That's when I noticed something else strange. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds chirping, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just a heavy, unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. We found a spot where the cliff face was less steep, and we carefully made our way down to the water's edge. There was a flat rock jutting out a bit into the water that made a perfect place to sit. We cracked open our drinks and tried to relax, but both of us kept scanning the tree line above us. After about 10 minutes of sitting there, a loud splash broke the silence. It came from about 30 feet out in the water, like someone had jumped in. We both jumped up and stared at the spot where ripples were spreading across the previously glass-like surface. Nothing emerged, no swimmer, no animal, nothing. "Did you see anything?" I asked Eric. "No, man, just the splash." We sat back down, but now we were both visibly tense. I kept my eyes locked on the water, waiting for whatever had caused the splash to surface. About 5 minutes later, another splash hit the water, bigger and deeper than the first, and a bit closer to us. Again, nothing visible caused it. "Did you throw something?" I asked Eric, even though I'd been watching him the whole time. "No, I didn't throw anything. What the hell is going on?" A third splash came, even closer now, maybe 15 feet from where we were sitting. The ripples lapped against our rock, and I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. "Let's get out of here," Eric said, standing up. We started scrambling up the rocks, and just as we reached the top of our little path, a fourth splash hit the water, exactly where we'd been sitting moments before. That's when the real terror started. As we hurried along the rim back toward the way we came in, something crashed through the branches above us and slammed into the ground with a heavy thud about 10 feet behind us. We both spun around, but I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was something big, maybe the size of a basketball or small log, but it moved in a blur as it landed. "Run!" Eric shouted, and we took off. More heavy crashing steps came from the brush to our left, following us as we ran. Another projectile, I never got a clear look at what these things were. Landed closer, maybe 5 feet to my right. Whatever was throwing these things was strong, really strong. We sprinted back into the forest, the same brutal underbrush that had been so difficult to navigate now tearing at our skin as we plowed through it at full speed. The blackberry thorns ripped at my arms and face, but the adrenaline was so intense I barely felt it. The whole time, we could hear movement in the brush parallel to us, keeping pace. The screeching sound came again, louder and more aggressive, like it was angry we were leaving. About halfway back to the car, we had to cross this small creek on a mossy log. I was halfway across when something massive splashed in the water just 5 feet below me. The splash was so big, it actually got me wet. I nearly fell off the log, but somehow kept my balance and made it across. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. By the time we got there, we were both bleeding from dozens of thorn cuts, our clothes were torn, and we were shaking from the adrenaline dump. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the doors. We jumped in, and I peeled out of there as fast as my old Subaru could manage on that rough road. We didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes of the drive back. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "What the fuck was that, Ryan?" "I don't know, man. I honestly don't know." At first, I thought maybe we had stumbled into someone's secret spot, like maybe some locals who didn't want outsiders, finding their swimming hole. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. Those screeches weren't human. The way whatever it was kept pace with us through that thick underbrush wasn't normal. And the size and weight of the objects being thrown at us, that wasn't just kids messing with us. I've done a lot of research since then, reading about similar experiences people have had in the Pacific Northwest. The screeches, the targeted splashes in water, the thrown objects. It all matches up with reported Bigfoot behavior. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I feel ridiculous even typing it out. But I can't come up with any other explanation that fits everything we experienced. I've only been back to that general area a couple of times since then, always in winter, when the underbrush is less dense and visibility is better. I've never gone near that quarry again, and I never will. Not in summer anyway, when the forest is at its thickest. The thing that still haunts me the most is the feeling that whatever was out there was intelligent. Not just animal instinct, but actually thinking, planning, trying to intimidate us away from its territory. It seemed to know exactly where we were at all times, even though we never saw it directly. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, thinking I hear that metallic screech outside my window. I've tried telling a few people about what happened, but I usually leave out the parts that sound too crazy. I don't need people thinking I'm some Bigfoot conspiracy nut. But I know what I experienced. I know what I heard. I know what chased us through those woods. And sometimes knowing is worse than not knowing. That quarry is still out there, hidden in the woods, with its black, still water hiding who knows what beneath the surface. And something is guarding it, something that doesn't want to be seen, but isn't afraid to let you know it's watching. Something that can move silently through impossible terrain and can throw objects with enough force to make you fear for your life. I check satellite images of that area sometimes, watching to see if anyone has built roads closer to it or if development has reached that far into the forest. So far, it remains as isolated as it was when we found it, and that's probably for the best. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. I guess the recent string of disappearances in Glacier has finally pushed me to get this off my chest. What happened that night at Numa Ridge Lookout Tower haunts me to this day, and I can't shake the feeling that I might have prevented some of these tragedies if I'd just been braver. For 20 summers, I worked as a fire lookout in Glacier National Park. It was the perfect job for someone like me. I've always been a loner, and I loved the solitude and the breathtaking views. My tower at Numa Ridge was perched at almost 7,000 feet, overlooking the North Fork area of the park. I'd spend my days scanning the horizon for smoke, reading books, and occasionally chatting with hikers who made the steep trek up to my little sanctuary in the sky. Over those years, I'd heard all the Bigfoot stories. The locals and Native Americans had their legends, and every few years some tourist would claim they saw something in the woods. I never gave it much thought. 20 years watching the wilderness through a high-powered scope, and I'd never seen anything I couldn't explain. Bears, elk, moose, sure. Hairy humanoids, nope. I was firmly in the skeptic camp. That changed during my final summer at Numa Ridge 5 years ago. It was early August, hot and dry, fire danger at extreme. I was on high alert, scanning the forests regularly for any sign of smoke. Around midday, I heard the familiar sound of boots on the metal steps of my tower. Visitors weren't unusual, though they were always a welcome break from the isolation. "Hello up there," called a friendly voice. "Come on up," I answered, setting aside my coffee. A guy in his mid-30s appeared at the top of the stairs, red-faced and breathing hard from the climb. He introduced himself as Mark, said he was a photographer from Seattle doing a solo backpacking trip through the park. "Mind if I catch my breath up here for a bit?" he asked. "The view is incredible." "Stay as long as you like," I said. "I've got fresh coffee if you want some." Mark accepted gratefully, and we fell into easy conversation. He was interested in my job, asking about the tower's equipment and how I spotted fires. I showed him my Osborne firefinder, the maps, and finally my pride and joy, a high-powered spotting scope I'd bought with my own money. "This baby can pick out details miles away," I told him. "Want to take a look?" I adjusted the scope toward a meadow about 3 miles away, where I sometimes watched deer grazing. Mark bent down to look, then suddenly stiffened. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. "What do you see?" I asked, curious. There's something out there. 2 things. They look like they're digging." I gently nudged him aside and peered through the scope myself. What I saw made my blood run cold. About 3 miles away, in the clearing near Bowman Creek, were 2 figures. They were hunched over, digging in the dirt with what looked like sticks or tools. They weren't bears. Bears don't dig like that. They weren't park rangers or hikers either. Their movements were too fluid, too deliberate. "Do you see them?" Mark asked, his voice tight. "Yeah," I managed to say. "I'm not sure what they are." As we watched, a black bear wandered into the meadow from the tree line. The 2 figures immediately stopped what they were doing and stood upright. That's when I got my first good look at them. They were tall, at least 6 feet, and covered in what appeared to be dark, matted hair. But they weren't massive and bulky like you'd expect from a Bigfoot. They were wiry, almost slender. The bear seemed to notice them and paused. Then, to my astonishment, it turned and bolted back into the forest. Those things hadn't made any threatening moves. They just stood there, and the bear wanted nothing to do with them. After the bear left, the figures resumed their digging. They worked for another minute, then suddenly both stopped and looked up, almost as if they were staring directly at us. It was impossible, of course. We were miles away, and even with binoculars, they couldn't have spotted us in the tower. But somehow, I felt seen. "I think I should head back down before it gets late," Mark said suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Thanks for the coffee and the tour." I nodded, still disturbed by what we'd witnessed. "Be careful out there," I said. "Stay on the marked trails." After he left, I couldn't stop thinking about those figures. I kept returning to the scope throughout the afternoon, but they were gone, the meadow empty except for some disturbed earth where they'd been digging. As the sun began to set, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. I've spent countless nights alone in that tower, through thunderstorms and howling winds, and never once felt afraid. But that evening, something felt wrong. Very wrong. I found myself checking the locks on my trapdoor and windows, something I rarely bothered with. I drew the curtains tight. I even retrieved my shotgun from its case under my bed and loaded it. The Park Service didn't officially know I kept it up there, but many lookouts had protection, especially in grizzly country. I tried to sleep, but kept jerking awake at every sound. Around 2 in the morning, I was startled fully awake by a distinctive sound. A hard whack against one of the tower's support beams, then another and another. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a branch. Something was hitting my tower. I grabbed my flashlight and shotgun and moved to the window, carefully peeling back the curtain just enough to peer out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the wooden deck that surrounded the tower. I didn't see anything at first, but the whacking continued, now moving to different parts of the structure. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Voices. Not human voices, but not animal sounds either. It was like a language, with distinct patterns and inflections, but like nothing I'd ever heard before. The sounds were guttural, with clicks and whistles mixed in. And then, among the foreign sounds, I distinctly heard English words, "Come out and help us," spoken in a stilted, almost mocking tone. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my shotgun. I backed away from the window, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The voices continued for several minutes, then suddenly stopped. The silence was somehow worse. Then came a new sound, crying. It started as a whimper, then grew into a pitiful wail that sounded disturbingly like a human baby in distress. It was coming from directly beneath the trap door that led up to my tower. Every instinct told me not to open that door, not to investigate. This wasn't a lost child or an injured hiker. This was something trying to lure me out. I considered using my radio to call for help, but what would I say? That I was hearing strange voices and crying. They'd think I'd lost my mind from isolation. Still, I moved toward the radio on my desk, keeping my shotgun ready. That's when I felt it. A prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned slowly toward the south-facing window. A face was pressed against the glass. It wasn't human. It wasn't a bear. The face was roughly humanoid, but covered in short, stiff hair. The nose was flat and wide, the mouth a thin line, but the eyes, God, the eyes. They were large, black, and somehow glowing in the darkness. They didn't reflect light like an animal's eyes. They seemed to absorb it. I stood frozen, staring into those eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then I noticed movement at the east window. Another face, similar to the first but smaller, was peering in at me. They were surrounding the tower. Pure terror gave me strength. I raised my shotgun, pointing it directly at the face in the south window. The creature's expression changed. I swear it looked surprised, maybe even frightened. It ducked away from the window. I swung toward the east window, but that face was already gone too. I heard rapid movement on the deck outside, then the sound of something heavy sliding down the tower's support beams. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the center of the room, shotgun ready, jumping at every creak and groan of the tower. When dawn finally broke, I waited until full light before cautiously opening the trap door and peering down the stairs. What I saw confirmed I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Propped against the tower was a massive log, at least 15 feet long and 2 feet thick. It had been positioned to reach from the ground up to the deck of my tower, creating a crude ramp. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. That log would have weighed hundreds of pounds. No human could have moved it alone, maybe not even several humans together. I climbed down carefully, shotgun slung over my shoulder, and examined the area around the tower. The ground was disturbed everywhere, with strange, elongated footprints pressed into the dirt. They were roughly human-shaped, but too narrow, with toe impressions that seemed longer and more spread out than human toes. As I circled back to the base of the tower, I noticed something on one of the wooden supports, fresh marks carved into the wood. I leaned in closer, and my blood ran cold. It was a crude map. I recognized the distinctive shape of Balm Lake, the curve of the creek, and a small square that could only represent my lookout tower. In the location where the meadow would be, where we'd seen those figures digging, was a crude drawing of what looked like a human skull. My hands trembling, I took out my pocket knife and frantically scratched out the carving, gouging the wood until no trace of it remained. Then I went back up to the tower, threw my essential belongings into my backpack, grabbed my shotgun, and left. I practically ran down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the ranger station, I made up a story about a family emergency and quit on the spot. They were surprised. I'd never missed a day in 20 years, but they didn't question me too deeply. I moved to Missoula the following week and never set foot in Glacier National Park again. I started a lawn care business with my girlfriend, and we're doing pretty well now. Sometimes on clear nights, I look toward the mountains and feel a twinge of nostalgia for my old life in the tower. But then, I remember those eyes staring at me through the glass and that crude map carved into the wood. I still don't know what those creatures were, but they weren't the gentle, elusive Bigfoot of popular imagination. They were intelligent, cunning, and malevolent. Sometimes I think about that meadow, about what those creatures were digging for or burying. I think about the missing hikers reported in Glacier over the years, the ones never found. And I wonder if that crude skull drawing wasn't just a threat, but a record of what was already there. I'll never go back to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. Story 10. I've been hesitating to write this down for years, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can help me make sense of what happened. Back in '95, maybe early '96, it's been so long now, I got permission to hunt on this really remote piece of private land in Wayne County, Tennessee. I was pretty excited because good hunting spots are hard to come by, and this one seemed perfect. The owner, an older guy named Bill who knew my uncle, said I could use his property whenever I wanted during deer season. The spot was about 3 miles from the main road, bordered by cotton and soybean fields on one side and dense woods on the other. Bill mentioned there was an old logging road I could take my truck down to get closer to the hunting area. I decided to check it out in early September before the season officially started. I wanted to scout the area, maybe set up a stand if I found a good spot. I got up at 3:30 in the morning, packed my gear, grabbed some coffee, and headed out while it was still dark. The drive took about 45 minutes from my house, and I arrived around 5 in the morning. I remember it was chilly that morning, probably in the low 50s. The sky was still dark, but there was that faint glow on the horizon, telling me sunrise wasn't too far off. I found the logging road Bill had described and carefully navigated my Chevy Blazer down it. The road was pretty rough, overgrown in spots with deep ruts from the previous spring's rain. I had to go slow to avoid bottoming out. When I reached the end of the road, I pulled into a small clearing where I could park. I sat there for a few minutes, engine off, drinking my coffee and getting my bearings. That's when I noticed something odd. There was no sound, nothing, no insects chirping, no birds starting their morning calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows they're never completely silent, especially at dawn when everything's waking up. I figured maybe I was just early, or maybe the engine noise had temporarily scared everything away. So I decided to get out and start scouting. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The moment my boots hit the ground, I felt uneasy. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the woods were watching me. I walked to the front of my Blazer and was about to head toward the tree line when I heard a small thud on the hood of my vehicle. At first, I thought it was an acorn or something falling from a tree above, but when I shined my flashlight, I saw it was a small rock, maybe the size of a quarter. I looked up, confused. There weren't any branches directly above my truck. Before I could think about it too much, there was a louder thud. Something bigger had hit the hood, hard enough to make a small dent. I directed my flashlight and found a rock about the size of my palm. My heart started racing. There was no way that rock had fallen naturally. Someone or something had thrown it. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anyone out there?" No response, just that eerie silence. I quickly got back in my blazer, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I was turning around to leave, my headlights swept across the tree line, and I swear I saw something move back into the shadows. It was tall, taller than a man should be out there in the woods at 5 in the morning. I didn't get a good look, just an impression of height and mass disappearing between the trees. I got out of there fast, my tires spinning in the dirt as I accelerated down the logging road. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was probably just another hunter who didn't want company, or maybe some kids messing around. But deep down, I knew better. There was something very wrong about that place. After a few days, I started to feel foolish. I'm not the type to scare easily, and I've been hunting since I was 12. I decided to go back, but this time I asked my dad to come with me. He's an experienced outdoorsman, and I figured having another person would make me feel more at ease. We went on a Saturday morning, about a week after my first visit. The woods seemed more normal this time. Birds were singing, squirrels were active, and it felt like a regular forest. Dad and I spent a few hours walking the property, looking for game trails and good spots for a stand. That's when we found something strange. A tree, not a sapling, but a good-sized oak, maybe 15 inches in diameter, had been pushed over, not cut, not blown over by wind, but pushed. The root ball was partially exposed, and there was no sign of rot or disease that might have weakened it. Dad examined it carefully. "This is fresh," he said, pointing to the still moist soil around the roots. "Happened in the last week or so." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it must have happened after my first visit. What could push over a healthy oak tree? A storm might do it, but we hadn't had any severe weather. A vehicle could, but there were no tire tracks, and the spot was too far from the logging road anyway. Dad noticed my expression. "Probably just some kids with a four-wheeler or something," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that any more than I did. We finished our scouting trip without incident, and Dad had to head back early for a commitment he had that afternoon. I decided to stay a bit longer to check out one more area I was curious about, a dense part of the forest near where the property backed up to a small creek. It was late afternoon, probably around 4 or 5 o'clock. The sun was still up, but starting to get lower in the sky. I was making my way carefully through some thick underbrush when I heard it, a crashing sound from deeper in the woods, like something large moving through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but it was too loud, too powerful. The sound was like 10 deer moving at once, branches breaking, leaves rustling, the ground seemingly shaking with each impact. Whatever it was big and it was fast. I froze, instinctively crouching lower. The crashing continued, moving parallel to me along the tree line about 50 yards away. I could actually see the tops of smaller trees, swaying as this thing passed by them. That's when the smell hit me, like a musty basement mixed with something rotten and wild. It was so strong I had to cover my nose. The movement stopped suddenly. Complete silence fell again, just like during my first visit. I held my breath, straining to hear or see anything. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I got the distinct impression that whatever had been moving was now watching me. I slowly started backing away, trying to be as quiet as possible. That's when I heard a low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, deeper than that, almost like a bass note you feel more than hear. It seemed to come from the direction where the movement had stopped. I didn't wait around. I turned and walked as quickly as I could back toward my truck, fighting the urge to run. Running triggers predatory instincts, every hunter knows that. But with each step, I could feel eyes on my back. I kept looking over my shoulder, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. When I finally reached my blazer, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror. half expecting to see something emerging from the tree line behind me. Over the next few weeks, as hunting season properly started, I tried to convince myself to go back. After all, I had permission for what should have been prime hunting grounds, but I couldn't do it. Something felt deeply wrong about that place. What bothered me most was that during all my visits, I never once saw a deer. Not a single one, not even tracks or droppings. In Tennessee in September, that's almost impossible for good hunting land. Deer should have been everywhere. About a month later, I ran into Bill, the landowner, at the local hardware store. He asked how my hunting was going, and I awkwardly explained that I'd decided to hunt elsewhere. I was too embarrassed to tell him the real reason, so I made up some excuse about the area being too difficult to access. He gave me a strange look and said something that still haunts me. "Yeah, nobody has really had any luck back there. Strange, isn't it? Land that good should be crawling with game." The way he said it made me wonder if he knew something, if maybe other hunters had experienced similar things but like me had been too embarrassed to mention it. It's been over 25 years now, and I've never gone back to that spot. I've hunted all over Tennessee and even in other states, but nothing has ever felt like those woods in Wayne County. Sometimes I wonder if I should have investigated further, maybe gone back with more people or cameras. But honestly, I'm glad I didn't. I don't know what was in those woods. Maybe it was a bear, though bears weren't common in that part of Tennessee back then. Maybe it was some other animal I'm not familiar with. Or maybe, and I can hardly believe I'm writing this, it was something else entirely. Something that doesn't want humans in its territory. Something that knows how to throw rocks, push over trees, and move through dense forest faster than should be possible. All I know for sure is that whatever it was, it had claimed that forest as its own, and it made damn sure I knew I wasn't welcome there. Story 11. I still get a chill down my spine when I think about what happened that day in Stanley County. It's been 3 years, but the memory is still so clear it might as well have happened yesterday. My dad and I were wrapping up a weekend camping trip in Uhari National Forest. It was late October, not quite cold yet, but definitely getting there. The leaves were changing, and the forest had that musty fall smell that always reminds me of childhood camping trips. We'd packed up early that Sunday morning, around 6 a.m., because Dad wanted to get home in time to watch the Panthers game. The sun was just starting to come up as we pulled out of our campsite, and the forest was still kind of foggy and quiet. I remember being pretty tired. We'd stayed up late the night before, telling ghost stories around the campfire, which seems ironic now, considering what happened next. We were driving down this narrow forest road. I think it was Highway 109. But I'm not 100% sure anymore. It was just the two of us in Dad's old Ford F-150. I was slouched in the passenger seat, half asleep, watching the trees go by through the window. We hadn't passed another car for at least 20 minutes. The road was winding through a particularly dense section of forest when I sat up straight. Something was on the road ahead of us, maybe 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was a bear. We'd seen them before in Uhari, though they usually avoided the roads. "Dad," I said, pointing ahead, "you see that?" He slowed the truck down, squinting through the windshield. "Yeah, I see something. What the hell is that?" As we got closer, I realized it wasn't a bear. It was walking on 2 legs, for one thing. And it was big, really big. It was moving slowly, kind of lumbering along the right side of the road. It didn't seem to notice us at first. Dad had slowed the truck to maybe 15 miles per hour, and we were just creeping forward. I remember gripping the dashboard, leaning forward to get a better look. The thing was dark, not black, but like a deep, muddy brown. And tall. God, it was so tall. "Thomas, are you seeing this?" Dad whispered, even though we were inside the truck with the windows up. Something about what we were looking at made him want to be quiet. "Yeah," I whispered back. "What is that thing?" We were maybe 50 feet away when it happened. The thing just stopped walking. It went completely still for a second, and then it turned its head, just its head, and looked back at us. I'll never forget that moment. It wasn't like an animal looking back at you. It was deliberate. It knew we were there, and it was. Checking to see if we had noticed it. I couldn't make out facial features or anything like that. It was still early morning, and the light wasn't great. Plus, there was this weird fog hanging low on the road, but I could tell it was looking right at us. And then it moved. It didn't run exactly, but it moved with this unnatural quickness off the road and into the tree line. It didn't crash through the underbrush like you'd expect something that size to do. It just disappeared into the trees. Dad stopped the truck completely, and we sat there in silence for a few seconds. "Did you see that?" he finally asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I said. "What the hell was it?" "I don't know." We sat there for another minute, just staring at the spot where it had gone into the woods. Then Dad pointed at something. "Look at that sign up there," he said. About 20 yards ahead was one of those yellow diamond-shaped signs warning about curves in the road. Dad put the truck in gear and slowly pulled up next to it. "That thing walked right in front of this sign," he said, "and it completely blocked it from view." I looked at the sign. It was mounted on a post about 8 feet high. "So whatever that was," I started. "It was at least 8 feet tall," Dad finished. "Maybe taller." We looked at each other, and I could see Dad was as freaked out as I was. He's not the type to get scared easily. He was in the army for 12 years, did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've never seen him rattled by much of anything, but he was rattled now. "Let's check it out," he said, reaching for his door handle. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You want to go looking for that thing?" "We're not going looking for it," he said. "I just want to see where it went into the trees." I didn't want to get out of the truck, but I also didn't want to sit there alone. So I followed him. Dad grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, even though it was getting light out by then. We walked to the spot where we'd seen the thing leave the road. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and pine needles. Dad shined the flashlight around, then looked back at me with a weird expression. "What?" I asked. "There's no tracks," he said. "Nothing." I looked where he was pointing. He was right. The ground at the edge of the road was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had passed through there at all. "That's impossible," I said. "That thing was huge. It would have left some kind of mark." "You'd think so," Dad said. He stepped off the road and into the trees, moving the flashlight beam back and forth. I followed him, staying close. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Usually there'd be birds, squirrels, something making noise, but there was nothing. Dad stopped about 10 feet in. "There's nothing here," he said. "No broken branches, no disturbed leaves. Nothing." He was right. It looked like nothing had come through here at all, but we'd both seen it. We'd both watched it walk off the road and into these exact trees. "Dad, this is freaking me out," I admitted. "Can we go?" He nodded, and we hurried back to the truck. As we were getting in, I noticed something and grabbed his arm. "Dad, look." About 50 yards further down the road, standing just inside the tree line, was a dark shape. It was only visible for a second before it moved back, deeper into the forest. But it was there. Dad saw it too. He jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. We took off down the road faster than was probably safe, given the curves. Neither of us said anything for a good 5 minutes. Finally, Dad spoke. "That wasn't a bear." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't. It wasn't a person either. No person is that big." I nodded. "The way it moved." "Yeah," Dad said. "Too fast. Too smooth." "And it didn't leave any tracks." Dad gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I know what you're thinking, Thomas." "Do you?" "Because I'm thinking we just saw Bigfoot." He didn't laugh, or tell me I was being ridiculous. He just nodded slowly. "Maybe," or something like it. We drove the rest of the way home, mostly in silence. Every now and then, one of us would say something like, "Did that really happen?" And the other would nod. When we got home, Mom asked us how the camping trip was, and we both just said fine and started unpacking. Later that night, Dad and I sat on the back porch and talked about it more. "The thing that bothers me most," Dad said, "is how it knew we were watching it. It sensed us somehow. And how it moved without disturbing anything," I added. "Something that big should have left a trail a mile wide." "Exactly," Dad said. "Natural things leave evidence. They break branches, they leave footprints, they make noise. So what are you saying? It wasn't natural?" Dad looked out into our backyard for a long time before answering. "I'm saying I don't know what it was, and that bothers me. We talked about reporting it, maybe calling the park rangers or something, but in the end, we didn't. What would we say? We saw something big in the forest that disappeared without a trace. They'd think we were crazy or pulling a prank, so we kept it to ourselves, until now, I guess. I'm writing this down because I need to tell someone. The whole thing only lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it changed how I see the world. I used to think I understood the rules of how things work. Now I know better. I've gone back to Uhari a few times since then, always with groups of friends, never alone. I've never seen anything like that again. Part of me hopes I never do. But another part of me wants proof that I'm not crazy, that what Dad and I saw was real. Sometimes I wake up at night with this feeling that something is watching me through my bedroom window. I'll get up and look outside, half expecting to see that dark shape standing in our yard, looking up at me. I never see anything, but the feeling doesn't go away. Whatever was in those woods that day wasn't something that should exist in our world. It moved wrong. It was aware in a way animals aren't, and it could vanish without leaving a single trace. I still don't know what it was. I just know that when it turned and looked at us, it knew we were there, and something about that knowledge terrifies me more than anything else. Story 12. I'm still trying to process what happened to me last summer at my lake house. This was July 2021, and I've owned this little place on Lake Hartwell in upstate South Carolina for about 8 years now. It's nothing fancy, just a small 2-bedroom on about 3 acres that backs up to the water. I've always felt safe there. It's quiet, peaceful, and until that night my biggest concern was making sure the pipes didn't freeze in winter. That night started like any other summer evening at the lake. I'd driven up from Greenville on Friday after work, planning to spend the weekend fishing and doing some minor repairs around the property. My 2 dogs were with me. Rex, my Great Pyrenees, who's about 130 pounds of pure guardian instinct, and Sadie, a border collie mix who doesn't miss a thing. After grilling a steak for dinner, I decided to enjoy the evening by the water. It was a clear night with a half moon, and the temperature had finally dropped to something bearable after a scorching day. Around 11 that night, I was sitting in my lawn chair by the small fire pit at the edge of my property, maybe 15 feet from the dock. I had a beer, the dogs were lounging nearby, and I was just watching the flames and enjoying the quiet. The lake was dead calm that night. You know how sometimes water gets so still it looks like glass? That's how it was. No boats out, no wind, nothing. That's when I heard the first splash. It wasn't a fish jump. I've been fishing these waters long enough to know what that sounds like. This was heavy, deliberate, a solid ka-thunk sound, like someone had dropped a bowling ball into deep water. I looked up, thinking maybe it was a branch falling from one of the tall pines that line the property, but there was no breeze at all. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a turtle had slipped off a log or something, but then, about 5 minutes later, there was another one, and another. Each splash was coming from different spots along the shoreline, all within about 100 yards of where I was sitting. After the 4th splash, I got curious. I keep a high-powered spotlight in the dock storage box for night fishing, so I grabbed it and shined it out across the water where I'd heard the last splash. Nothing there, just ripples spreading out from whatever had hit the water. Then, as I was scanning the shoreline, I heard another splash. This one much closer, maybe 30 feet out from my dock. And this time, I saw something hit the water. It wasn't a branch or an animal, it was a rock. I walked out onto the dock and shined the light where the object had landed. The water's only about 4 feet deep there, and I could clearly see a whitish rock at the bottom that hadn't been there before. Something was throwing rocks into the lake. My first thought was kids playing pranks. There are a few other houses along this stretch of shoreline, though none very close to mine. But as I stood there, another rock hit the water, this one landing just feet from where I was standing on the dock. The splash got me a little wet. I swept the beam of my spotlight across the opposite shore, a good 200 feet away, but saw nothing moving. No figures, no flashlights, nothing but dense trees and underbrush. Whatever had thrown that rock had to have some serious arm strength to chuck a rock that distance with that kind of accuracy. I decided to retrieve the rock that had landed near the dock. Using a net I keep for fishing, I managed to scoop it up. It was a piece of quartz, like you, find all over these hills, roughly the size of my fist and weighing maybe a pound or two, not something that would just fall into the water by accident. As I was examining the rock, I heard another splash further down the shoreline, then another. It was like whatever was throwing them was moving along the opposite shore, working its way around the cove. I'm not going to lie. At this point, I was getting a little freaked out. I'm a pretty rational guy, but something about the situation felt off. I called the dogs closer to me and decided to wait it out a bit longer. The splashes continued, spaced about 5 to 7 minutes apart, always from different spots along the far shoreline. Around midnight, things got even weirder. I started hearing vocalizations from across the cove, maybe a quarter mile away around the bend. At first, I thought it might be people talking, maybe teenagers partying. But as I listened, I realized it didn't sound like any language I recognized. It wasn't even like drunken yelling or hooting. It was rhythmic, almost like chanting, but in what sounded like complete gibberish. The pitch would rise and fall, sometimes sounding almost like questions and answers between multiple sources. I tried recording it on my phone, but the sound was too distant to pick up clearly. The best way I can describe it is like someone trying to mimic human speech patterns without knowing any actual words. It had structure to it, but no meaning I could discern. These sounds continued for about 30 minutes, during which the rock throwing had stopped. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the vocalizations ceased. The silence that followed felt even more unsettling than the noises had been. By this time, it was around 1 in the morning. I decided I'd had enough of sitting outside. I put out the fire and headed back to the house, calling the dogs to follow me. Rex seemed unusually alert, his head high and ears perked forward, scanning the tree line across the road that runs in front of my property. I let the dogs out into the fenced backyard to do their business before turning in. That's when Rex started barking, not his usual "there's a squirrel" bark, but his deep, serious warning bark that I'd only heard a few times before. He was facing the woods across the road, the fur on his back standing straight up. I grabbed the spotlight again and shined it toward where Rex was looking. The beam cut through the darkness between the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Then I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Not the crashing of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. Whatever it was seemed to be paralleling the road, moving away from my property. I called the dogs inside, locked all the doors, and checked that the windows were secure. I've never been one to scare easily, but I found myself sitting in my living room with the lights off, peering out the window toward the woods with my shotgun across my lap. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went down to the dock to look around in the daylight. I found 3 more rocks similar to the one I'd retrieved the night before, all in the shallow water near my dock. They were all quartz or similar stones, ranging from the size of a baseball to nearly as big as a cantaloupe. None of them matched the typical rocks found along my shoreline. What really disturbed me, though, was what I noticed over the next few days. The wildlife had changed completely. Before that night, my property had been a regular highway for local wildlife. I have trail cameras set up around the perimeter, and they would regularly capture deer, foxes, raccoons, and even the occasional coyote. My cameras would ping my phone several times a day with new motion captures. After that night, nothing. Not a single deer, no coyotes. Even the smaller animals seemed scarce. The cameras stopped pinging altogether. It was like everything had decided to give my property a wide berth. I walked my property line looking for tracks or scat, something I'd done regularly as part of monitoring the local wildlife. Where I used to find plenty of deer tracks along the game trail that cuts through my back acres, there was nothing fresh. The trail itself looked unused, already starting to be reclaimed by vegetation. I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I know that animals can sense things that humans can't. They avoid areas where they feel threatened. Something had scared everything away from my property. 2 weeks after the incident, I set up some additional cameras specifically aimed at the shoreline across from my dock. I wanted to see if I could catch whatever had been throwing those rocks. The cameras captured the usual: herons, a few turtles, some fish jumping, but nothing that could explain what I'd experienced. I've asked around discreetly, trying to find out if any neighbors had similar experiences. An older guy who lives about a half-mile down the shore mentioned that he'd heard weird noises a few times over the years, but had always attributed them to coyotes or owls. No one else seemed to have noticed anything unusual. I've gone back to the lake house several times since then, but I haven't stayed overnight alone again. The rock throwing hasn't repeated, at least not when I've been there, but the wildlife still hasn't returned to normal. My trail cameras remain unusually quiet, and the property feels different somehow, like it's being watched. I don't know what was out there that night. I've considered all the rational explanations I can think of. Other people playing pranks, some kind of territorial animal behavior, even the possibility that I misinterpreted natural phenomena while being tired and slightly buzzed from a couple beers. But none of those explanations satisfy what I experienced. What kind of person could throw rocks that size, that distance, with that kind of consistency? What animal makes vocalizations that sound like structured nonsense? And what could scare away every wild creature from a property they'd been freely traversing for years? I still own the lake house. I still go there. But I don't sit out by the water after dark anymore. And I always make sure my spotlight and shotgun are within reach. Story 13. I've never really told this story to many people. It happened back in August of 1977 when I was 13, and even now, 40+ years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My family used to go camping at Lake Shasta in Northern California every summer. It was our thing: fishing, swimming, hiking, all that outdoor stuff. This particular summer, we were staying at Antler Campground, which has these great coves and inlets perfect for fishing. That day started like any other camping day. My parents, my aunt and uncle, my little sister Kim, who was 9, my cousin Jimmy, 14, and I had spent the morning fishing from our boat. Around 2 in the afternoon, the adults decided they wanted to head back to the campsite to start dinner prep and have some beers. Kim was getting antsy too. You know how kids get when they've been sitting still for too long. Jimmy and I, though, we were determined to catch something decent. We'd only caught a couple of small bass all day, and we wanted to show up the adults by bringing back something worth cooking. We begged to stay at this little cove we'd found earlier that had some promising spots. After some back and forth, the adults agreed we could stay if Kim went with us, and we promised to be back before 5. So the boat dropped us off at this little pebbly beach area in the cove. The adults took the boat back to the marina about half a mile away. The 3 of us were having a good time for about an hour, but then Kim started complaining about being hot and bored and wanting to go back. Jimmy and I were deep into fishing mode and didn't want to leave. I remember checking my watch. It was around 3:30 when I decided I'd walk Kim back to the dock and then return to keep fishing with Jimmy. The marina wasn't far. Just follow the shoreline trail for about 15 minutes and you'd be there. I told Jimmy I'd be back in half an hour or so, and he just nodded, focused on casting his line. Kim and I walked along the trail, with me carrying both our tackle boxes. I dropped her off with my mum, who was sitting at a picnic table near the dock with my aunt. I remember Mum asking if I wanted to stay for a snack, but I was eager to get back to fishing. I told her Jimmy and I would be back by 5 as promised and headed back toward the cove. That's when things got weird. The trail between the marina and our fishing spot wasn't particularly difficult, just a dirt path that wound through some woods along the shoreline. In some spots, it was maybe 20 or 30 feet from the water's edge. In others, it went a bit deeper into the trees, but you could always see the lake. I'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own feet on the dirt path. But then I realized the steps I was hearing were slightly off rhythm from my own, like an echo that was just a fraction of a second too late. I stopped walking to listen, and the footsteps stopped too. Complete silence except for some distant birds and the soft lapping of the lake water. I shrugged it off and started walking again. The footsteps started again too. This time I was paying closer attention. They definitely weren't mine. They were coming from somewhere in the trees to my right, away from the lake. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped. I started walking. They started walking. I remember my heart beginning to pound. I told myself it was probably just a deer or something paralleling the path. That happens in the woods, sometimes, but deer don't typically match your pace like that. I picked up my speed a little. The footsteps matched me. I was about halfway back to the cove at this point. Part of me wanted to turn around and run back to the marina, but I didn't want to leave Jimmy alone. And honestly, I was a 13-year-old boy. I didn't want to look like a scaredy cat over some weird forest noises. So I kept going, trying to ignore the footsteps that were clearly keeping pace with me, just out of sight in the trees. I even called out once, "Hello, is someone there?" No response, except the footsteps stopped while I was talking, then resumed when I started walking again. I was getting seriously freaked out now, walking faster and faster. The footsteps were getting faster too, and they sounded heavier, like whatever was making them was big, and they were getting closer to the trail. I was practically jogging now, my tackle box banging against my leg. The cove was just around the next bend in the trail. I could see the water through the trees, thinking if I could just get there, where Jimmy was, I'd feel safer. That's when it happened. There was a massive crashing sound from the woods, like something huge was plowing through the underbrush. I froze in absolute terror as something big burst through the trees directly toward me. It stopped about 5 feet away from me on the trail, and we just stared at each other. I don't know how long we stood there, probably just seconds, but it felt like hours. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even breathe. All I could do was stare at this thing that was staring right back at me. It was huge, probably 7 or 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. It had these piercing reddish-brown eyes that seemed to look right through me. Not animal eyes. There was something almost human-like in them, but not quite. They gave me this overwhelming feeling of dread, like they were sizing me up. Its arms were massive and muscular, hanging down with huge hands that looked like they could crush my skull without effort. Its feet were enormous, easily twice the size of my dad's boots. And its body, its entire body was covered in this dark brownish-black hair. Not fur exactly, more like really coarse human hair. Through the hair I could see muscles rippling. The thing was built like a linebacker on steroids. The smell hit me too, this musky, wild odor that was like nothing I'd ever smelled before or since. Kind of like wet dog mixed with something rotten and something else I can't even describe. I remember one detail so clearly. There was a patch on its chest where the hair was slightly lighter colored, almost in a pattern, and there was a small scar or mark above its right eye. These little details somehow made it more terrifying because they made it more real. I finally managed to find my voice and yelled, "Jimmy, Jimmy, look!" My voice sounded strange, even to me, high-pitched and strangled. The cove was just around the bend, and Jimmy must have heard me because I heard him crashing through the brush from the beach area. He came around the corner of the trail and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw what I was looking at. Jimmy took one look at the creature, let out this blood-curdling scream, dropped his fishing pole, and bolted straight for the water. Without hesitation, he jumped right into the lake and started swimming toward the middle of the cove. I'm not sure if it was Jimmy's scream or what, but something broke the spell that had me frozen in place. I dropped my tackle box and ran after Jimmy, splashing into the water and swimming as hard as I could toward the center of the cove. When I looked back, the creature was still standing on the shore, watching us. It hadn't moved from where it first appeared, but its head was turning, following our movements in the water. I remember thinking how strange it was that it didn't chase us or roar or do anything aggressive. It just watched. Jimmy kept swimming toward the marina, but I stopped about 50 yards from shore. Something made me pause, some mixture of fear and fascination. I treaded water, staring back at the creature, and it stared at me. Then something bizarre happened. The creature suddenly jerked its head around like it heard something behind it that startled it. It seemed almost afraid. In one fluid motion, it turned and ran up the hillside behind the trail. And when I say ran, I've never seen anything move like that. This was a steep hill, easily 45 degrees, covered in dense brush and trees. It covered several hundred feet in seconds, moving through terrain that would have taken me half an hour to climb. Then it was gone, disappeared into the forest. I stayed in the water for what felt like forever, just staring at the spot where it vanished. Eventually, I swam to shore and cautiously made my way back to the trail. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I found my tackle box where I'd dropped it. Some of the contents had spilled out, and I remember how my hands shook as I picked up my stuff. I practically ran back to the marina after that. When I got there, Jimmy was already telling everyone about a monster we'd seen, but the adults were laughing it off as an overactive imagination or maybe a bear. I tried to explain what we'd seen, but I could tell from their faces they didn't believe us. Here's the thing that makes my blood run cold to this day. While we were all sitting at the picnic tables near the marina about an hour later, still arguing about what Jimmy and I had seen, a couple of hikers walked by. They overheard us talking and stopped. The woman said, very casually, "Oh, you guys saw one of the Bigfoot creatures. They visit our cabin up on the hill sometimes." Everyone went quiet. The hikers seemed completely unfazed, like this was normal conversation. They pointed up to a cabin on the hillside, the same hill where the creature had disappeared. Then they just continued on their way, leaving us all staring after them. My parents tried to rationalize it all away, saying the hikers were just messing with us, that we'd seen a bear, that our imaginations had run wild. But Jimmy and I knew what we saw, and I've never been able to explain it. That was more than 40 years ago, and I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings since then. There have been dozens of reports from the Shasta area over the years. Some of them describe exactly what I saw: the reddish-brown eyes, the patch of lighter hair on the chest. I've never gone back to Antler Campground. My family tried to get me to go the following summer, but I refused. I still go camping and hiking. I didn't let that experience ruin the outdoors for me. But every time I'm in the woods and hear something moving just out of sight, I freeze, and I listen to see if the footsteps match my own. Story 14. I never believed in Bigfoot. Never. My dad was the practical type who taught me to trust what I could see with my own eyes, touch with my hands. We were simple folks living in Oroville, California, getting by with what we had. But what happened on July 12, 1969, changed everything I thought I knew about this world. I was just a teenager then, 15 years old. Dad and I were working in our backyard on Cherokee Road. It was one of those hot summer days, the kind where the air feels thick and your shirt sticks to your back within minutes. We had been hunting earlier that morning and had some rabbit carcasses to clean up. It was a normal day, so damn normal. Dad had a little fire going in the pit we'd dug out back. We were burning the rabbit entrails, something we'd done dozens of times before. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was just part of life for us. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead, watching the smoke curl up into the clear blue sky. Dad was telling me about some repairs he wanted to make to our shed that weekend. I still remember exactly what I was doing when it happened. I was poking at the fire with a stick, watching the intestines shrivel up in the flames. There was nothing special about that moment until everything changed. The first thing I noticed was Dad going completely silent mid-sentence. When I looked up at him, his face had gone pale and his eyes were fixed on something behind me. That's when I felt it, this weird sensation like the air had suddenly gotten heavier. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of our property, where our yard met the woods, was... I don't even know how to describe it properly. A creature, a massive creature just standing there, watching us. It wasn't hiding behind trees or crouching. It was standing upright like a person, but it was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall. The thing was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but hair. Grayish, about 3 inches long all over its body except for its face and hands. Its face, God, its face. It looked almost human, but not quite. The features were flatter, wider, but the eyes were what got me. They were dark and intelligent, looking right at us with what seemed like curiosity. And I can't believe I'm writing this part, but it's true. The creature had breasts, large hanging breasts that made it clear this was a female. I know how that sounds, but I swear on everything I hold dear, that's what I saw. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, we all just froze. Dad, me, and this creature staring at each other. It was standing maybe 15 feet away from us, close enough that I could see its chest moving as it breathed, close enough that if it decided to charge, we'd have no chance to run. Dad slowly reached for my shoulder, his hand shaking. He didn't say a word, but I could feel him trembling. I've never seen my father afraid before or since. He was always the rock, the one who faced everything head on. But in that moment, he was terrified. And that scared me more than anything. The creature tilted its head slightly, still watching us. Then, without warning, it moved, but not toward us. It walked, and I mean walked on 2 legs, just like a human, over to our outhouse. Its movements were fluid, not jerky or awkward like you might expect. It moved with purpose, with a natural gait that was both familiar and completely alien. It stopped at our outhouse and seemed to examine it, running one of its massive hands along the wooden door. Its hands looked almost human too, but larger, with darker skin. It wasn't destroying anything or acting aggressive. It seemed curious. Then something changed. Maybe it heard something we couldn't, or maybe it just decided it had seen enough. But suddenly, it turned its head sharply toward the forest, and then it ran. It didn't lumber or hop like a gorilla. It ran upright, with long strides that ate up the ground faster than any human could move. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the dense trees beyond our property. The moment it was gone, Dad grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "Kevin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "did you see that?" I couldn't even answer. My throat had closed up. All I could do was nod. We stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where it had vanished, the rabbit entrails still smoldering in the fire pit. Finally, Dad pulled me toward the house, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "We need to call someone," he said. "But who do you call when you see something that isn't supposed to exist?" Dad eventually called the sheriff's office. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, hands still shaking, as he tried to explain what we'd seen without sounding crazy. The deputy who came out clearly thought we were making it up or had seen a bear. He took some notes, looked around, half-heartedly, and left. But the thing is, we weren't the only ones who saw something. Later that week, we heard that Bill Creston, who lived about a mile down Cherokee Road, had seen the same thing walking through the meadow near his property. Said it stopped by an old stump, seemed to look around, then continued into the woods. By the end of summer, word was spreading that at least a dozen people in the Oroville area had reported similar sightings. Some folks came around asking questions. Reporters, researchers, people who called themselves cryptozoologists. Dad and I told our story so many times I could recite it in my sleep. Some believed us, some didn't. It didn't matter. We knew what we saw. The weeks after our sighting were strange. I couldn't sleep properly. Every night, I'd lie awake listening for sounds outside my window. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves would send my heart racing. Dad started keeping his shotgun by the door, something he'd never done before. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the tree line, hardly talking. I'd catch Dad staring into the woods sometimes with this look on his face I couldn't quite figure out. It wasn't just fear, it was something more complicated, like he was trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly expanded beyond what he understood. One night, about 2 weeks after our encounter, I woke up to the sound of our dogs barking like crazy. They were outside in their pen, and they only got that worked up when something was wrong. I jumped out of bed and ran to my window, which faced the backyard. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in a pale light. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the dogs were all pressed against the side of their pen, furthest from the woods, barking and growling at something I couldn't see. I was about to go wake Dad when I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Something large was moving between the trunks, just inside the forest line. I could make out a shape, taller than the underbrush, moving slowly parallel to our property. It never came into the clearing, just moved along the boundary between our world and the forest. I watched, frozen, as it made its way along the tree line before disappearing deeper into the woods. The dogs kept barking for another hour before finally settling down. I never woke Dad. Somehow, I knew the creature hadn't meant us harm. If it had, it would have come into the yard. The next morning, Dad and I found footprints at the edge of our property, massive footprints sunk deep into the soft earth. Dad put his boot next to one for comparison. His foot looked like a child's next to it. We followed the tracks as far as we could before they disappeared into the rockier terrain toward the foothills. Over the next few months, life gradually returned to something resembling normal, but things were different. I'd catch myself scanning the tree line whenever I was outside. I stopped going into the woods alone. Dad installed better locks on all our doors and windows. By September, the sightings around Oroville had increased. Some people reported finding strange hair caught on fences or tree bark. Others found more footprints. A couple claimed they heard unusual vocalizations at night. Not quite human, not quite animal. The thing that stuck with me most was how this creature had looked at us. There was intelligence in those eyes. It wasn't just some animal. It observed us, examined our outhouse, showed curiosity. Whatever it was thinking, reasoning. Even years later, when I was 21 and still living in Oroville, people were reporting sightings. I'd moved on with my life, got a job at the lumber mill, started dating, tried to be normal, but I never forgot. How could I? Dad and I never talked much about it as the years passed, but sometimes, sitting on the porch at sunset, he'd get a certain look in his eye as he gazed toward the woods. And I knew he was thinking about it too. I'm 47 now, and I've told this story maybe a handful of times in my life. Most people don't believe me, and I've learned to live with that. But I know what I saw that July day in 1969. I know it was real. Scientists might call it a North American ape, Locals call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what it was, and I don't know if it's still out there in the forests around Oroville. But I do know that sometimes when I visit my old hometown and drive down Cherokee Road, I slow down near those woods. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel like something is watching me from between the trees. I don't know if I want to see it again, or if I hope it stays hidden forever. All I know is that on that hot summer day in 1969, my dad and I came face to face with something that wasn't supposed to exist, and nothing has ever been the same since. Story 15. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids. I was always the practical one who'd roll my eyes at ghost stories and Bigfoot sightings. But what happened to my family and me back in 2005 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It was mid-October 2005, and my husband Daniel, our 10-year-old daughter Lily and I were heading out for some deer hunting in Forest Ranch, California. Daniel had been talking about this spot on Diamond Match Company land for weeks. Supposedly, there was this prized buck that frequented the area, and Daniel was determined to track it down. We got a late start that day. Between Lily's soccer practice and my shift running late, we didn't hit the road until almost 6 in the evening. By the time we reached the hunting grounds, it was pitch black. No moonlight, just an endless sea of darkness stretching beyond our headlights. The kind of darkness that makes you second-guess every shadow. Maybe we should just sleep in the truck tonight and start fresh in the morning, Daniel suggested, peering out at the darkness. I nodded, relieved. The thought of setting up camp in that darkness wasn't appealing. Our GMC Jimmy Blazer wasn't exactly spacious, but it would do for one night. We arranged ourselves as comfortably as possible, me in the front passenger seat reclined back, Daniel and Lily in the back with the seats folded down and our sleeping bags spread out. Sleep didn't come easy. The seat was uncomfortable, and every time I started to drift off, some small noise from the forest would jerk me back awake. The digital clock on the dash read 11:37 when I finally managed to fall into a restless sleep. I don't know exactly how long I'd been asleep when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, not the light scurrying of a raccoon or fox, but heavy, deliberate steps. Bipedal footsteps, like a person walking. My eyes shot open and I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps continued, moving toward our truck. My heart started hammering against my ribs. We were miles from the nearest campsite or road. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. Daniel, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. I reached back and shook his leg. Daniel, wake up! He stirred, mumbling something about 5 more minutes. There's someone outside, I hissed, and that got his attention. He sat up quickly, careful not to wake Lily. What? He whispered back, scooting forward between the front seats. Listen. The footsteps were right next to the truck now, heavy and measured. Whatever it was big, really big. I could feel the slight vibration through the vehicle with each step. Daniel and I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled our truck. They paused at the driver's side, where the window was cracked open about an inch for air. I swear I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths that didn't sound quite human. Then the steps continued around to the back of the truck, paused again, and then moved to the passenger side where I was sitting. I remember pressing myself as far away from the door as possible, my body rigid with fear. The footsteps paused right outside my window, and I had this overwhelming certainty that whatever was out there was looking in at me. I couldn't see anything through the darkness and the condensation on the windows, but I felt its presence. It felt like an eternity before the footsteps started again, continuing around the front of the truck and then off to the northeast. Daniel and I sat in silence for what felt like forever, afraid to speak or move. Lily was still asleep in the back, blissfully unaware of what was happening. What the hell was that? Daniel finally whispered, his voice shaking slightly. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then, Just as we started to relax slightly, we heard it. A scream. But not just any scream. This was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose in pitch and volume until it was this piercing, primal sound that seemed to go on forever. It lasted for at least 20 seconds, maybe longer. The sound was so loud, so intense, that it felt like it was vibrating through my bones, even though it had to be coming from at least 100 yards away, maybe more. It wasn't a mountain lion or a bear or any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, but not quite. Like something trying to mimic a human scream, but getting it horribly wrong. Lily woke up then, startled by the noise. "Mom? Dad? What was that?" Her voice was small and frightened. "It's okay, sweetie," I said automatically, trying to keep my own fear out of my voice. "Probably just some animal." But I didn't believe that. Neither did Daniel. His face had gone completely white, visible even in the dim light of the truck's interior. "We should go," he said quietly. I nodded, but we both knew we couldn't. Not in the pitch darkness, on unfamiliar forest roads. We were stuck until dawn. None of us slept after that. We sat huddled together, jumping at every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves outside. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how deliberate they were, how they had circled our truck, almost like whatever it was had been inspecting us. And that scream, I still hear it in my nightmares sometimes. When the first grey light of dawn finally appeared, Daniel wasted no time. He started the truck and we got out of there as fast as the rough roads would allow. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd experienced something we couldn't explain, something that defied our understanding of what should exist in those woods. We never went back to that spot. Despite Daniel's previous excitement about the buck, some things just aren't worth it. For years, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just another hunter playing a prank. Maybe it was some animal I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew better. And then, in 2008, I had my second encounter. Daniel and I were deer hunting again, this time in Challenge, California. Lily was at a friend's house. She'd lost interest in our hunting trips after that night in Forest Ranch, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. It was early morning, and we were walking along this old logging road. I was about 30 yards ahead of Daniel, who'd stopped to adjust his boot or something. The road had these high embankments on one side and a steep downslope on the other. The dust on the road was thick and undisturbed, perfect for tracking. I was looking down, noting the various animal tracks, deer, squirrel, raccoon, when I saw it. A footprint, but not just any footprint. This was huge, obviously barefoot, and unmistakably humanoid. It measured at least 14 inches long and nearly 5 inches wide. The impression was deep too, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The print was heading west down the slope. It was fresh. The edges were still crisp, not yet eroded by wind or time. "Daniel," I called, my voice higher than normal. "You need to see this." He jogged up to me, annoyed at first for my shouting, but his expression changed immediately when he saw what I was pointing at. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, crouching down to examine the print. That's not possible." But it was there, right in front of us. Undeniable. As we stood there staring at this impossible footprint, I felt it. That same sensation from 3 years ago, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Daniel felt it too. I could tell by the way his head snapped up, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We should go," he said quietly, just like he had that night in the truck. We tried to find more prints, but the middle of the road was hard-packed, leaving no impressions, and neither of us was brave enough to follow the downslope to see where the creature had gone. We left immediately, practically jogging back to our truck. The whole time, that feeling of being watched never left. It was like eyes were boring into my back, following our every move, I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened during those two encounters. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, watched documentaries, even joined online forums where people share similar experiences. And while part of me still tries to find some rational explanation, I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. There's something out there in the forests of Northern California, something that walks on two legs but isn't human, something that can scream so loud it feels like your eardrums might burst, something that leaves footprints no human could make. I don't go hunting anymore. Neither does Daniel. We sold our gear last year and took up fishing instead, on open lakes where you can see for miles in every direction, where nothing can sneak up on you or circle your truck in the middle of the night. Sometimes Lily asks about what happened that night. She was young, but she remembers the scream, the fear. I never know what to tell her. How do you explain something you don't understand yourself? All I know is that whatever we encountered out there, it changed us. Changed how we see the world and what we believe might be hiding in the dark corners of it. And if you're ever in those woods and hear footsteps circling your camp at night, or a scream that doesn't sound quite animal or quite human, don't stick around to investigate. Just leave as fast as you can, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Story 16. It's been 52 years, and I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes. I'm 73 now, but I can remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I've never told this story publicly before, but I figure I don't have many years left, and someone should know what happened that night in February 1971. I was 21 then, a Marine stationed at an armory near 29 Palms in San Bernardino County. Young, cocky, thought I knew everything. I'd been in the Corps for almost 2 years, and while I hadn't seen combat in Vietnam, I figured I was tough enough to handle whatever came my way. I was wrong. That night, I was assigned the midnight to 0600 watch at the armory's perimeter post. It was an isolated position about 400 yards from the main building, at the edge where the base property met the open desert. Just me, my M14, and miles of empty darkness stretching out toward the Joshua trees and beyond. February nights in the high desert get cold, man, real cold. I remember I had my jacket collar turned up against the wind, and I was pacing back and forth to keep warm. The moon was almost full that night, casting everything in this weird silvery light that made the shadows deeper and darker than usual. Around 0200 in the morning, I was making my regular circuit around the perimeter fence when I got this feeling. Hard to explain, but you know when you suddenly realize you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I scanned the desert beyond the fence. Nothing at first. Then I saw it. About 75 yards out, a large dark mass was moving across the desert floor. At first, I thought it might be a couple of guys hunched together, maybe trying to break into the armory. But as I watched, I realized it was just one thing. Too big to be a person. Way too big. My training kicked in. I raised my rifle, chambered around, and called out, "Halt! This is a restricted area. Identify yourself." My voice sounded thin in the vast darkness. The shape stopped, just stood there for maybe 10 seconds. Long enough for me to think maybe it was going to turn around and leave. Then it started moving again, not away, toward me, and not just walking. This thing was coming fast, impossibly fast. I yelled, "Halt!" again, louder this time, but it kept coming. That's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't human. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, moving on 2 legs but hunched forward. And it was covered in dark hair that looked almost black in the moonlight. My hands started shaking. I'd been trained to handle intruders, but this wasn't in any manual I'd ever read. I remember thinking, should I fire a warning shot? But my hands wouldn't move. I just stood there, watching this thing barrel straight toward me at a speed no human could match. When it was about 30 yards away, I finally raised my rifle to my shoulder. My finger was on the trigger, but I hesitated. I could see it clearly now. It looked like a giant, hair-covered man, but not a man. The proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too wide. And the face, Jesus, the face. It had deep-set eyes that caught. The moonlight, a flattened nose, and a mouth set in what looked like a permanent snarl. At 20 yards, I finally squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The fucking rifle jammed. I tried to clear it, but my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't manage it. And by then, it was too late. The thing crashed into the fence. The chain-link barrier might as well have been made of paper. It tore through with this horrible screeching sound of metal giving way, and then it was inside the perimeter. I dropped the rifle and drew my sidearm, but before I could aim, the creature was on me. The smell hit me first, this overpowering musk like wet animal fur mixed with something rotten. Then came the force of the impact as it slammed into me. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot 185 back then, but it picked me up like I was nothing. Its hands, if you could call them that, were huge, with fingers that felt like steel cables wrapping around my arms. I remember screaming, though I've always been ashamed to admit that. What Marine wants to say he screamed like a kid? It lifted me up to its face. Those eyes. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, not exactly. There was an intelligence there, but it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and cold. I managed to get my sidearm up and fire one shot. I don't think I hit it. Everything was happening too fast. But the sound seemed to startle it. It roared, not like a bear or a big cat. This was deeper, more guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. Then it threw me, not dropped me, threw me. I sailed through the air for what felt like forever before slamming into the ground about 15 feet away. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I think I may have blacked out for a few seconds. When I came to, I could hear it moving around nearby. I lay perfectly still, afraid to even breathe. My sidearm was gone, knocked from my hand when I landed. I could see my rifle on the ground about 10 feet away, but I knew I'd never reach it in time if that thing decided to come at me again. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. Time stopped making sense. Eventually, I heard a sound like heavy footsteps moving away, back toward the desert. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore before I dared to move. My whole body hurt. My uniform was torn, and I had cuts and bruises all over, but I was alive. I crawled to my rifle, expecting to find it jammed, but what I found was worse. The barrel was bent, not just a little, it was almost folded in half. No human could have done that with their bare hands. It would take industrial equipment to bend steel that way. I tried to get to the radio in my post to call for help, but my legs gave out. I collapsed again and just lay there, staring up at the stars, waiting for my relief to come at 0600. When the next guard found me, I was apparently babbling nonsense. They told me later I kept talking about the big man and not human. They thought I was having some kind of breakdown. The base doctor checked me out and found deep bruising consistent with being grabbed by something with immense strength. My arms had these perfect fingerprint bruises, but they were huge, much bigger than any human hand could make. I had 4 cracked ribs and a mild concussion. What happened next is why I've kept quiet all these years. By noon that day, 2 guys in suits showed up. They didn't identify themselves, but everyone knew they were government. FBI or CIA, we figured. They took me to an empty office and questioned me for hours, making me go over every detail again and again. They showed me photos of bears, mountain lions, even gorillas, asking if that's what I'd seen. When I insisted it was none of those things, one of them pulled out a folder with drawings of what looked like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. "Was it like this?" he asked, not even cracking a smile. That's when I realized they'd heard this before. This wasn't new to them. They made me sign some papers, non-disclosure agreements they called them, and told me discussing the incident with anyone would be considered a breach of national security. I'd be court-martialed, maybe worse. Before they left, one of the men, the older one with graying hair at his temples, took me aside. "You're not crazy, Marine," he said quietly. "There's been other reports. A couple living near the base saw two of these things crossing their front yard that same night, and the staff at Joshua Tree have been reporting sightings for years." "What are they?" I asked him. He shook his head. "Above my pay grade. But whatever they are, they've been here a lot longer than us." That was it. I was transferred to Camp Pendleton the following week. My service record was modified to say I'd been injured in a training accident. My bent rifle disappeared from the armory inventory like it had never existed. For a while after, I tried to research similar incidents around 29 Palms and Joshua Tree. I found scattered reports of hikers going missing, strange sounds in the night, giant footprints discovered in remote areas. But nothing concrete, nothing official. Over the years, I've told exactly 3 people: my wife, my best friend, and a therapist I saw for PTSD in the 90s. My wife believed me. My friend thought I was pulling his leg. The therapist suggested I might have experienced a stress hallucination brought on by the isolation of guard duty. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt when that thing grabbed me. And sometimes, when I'm camping or hiking in remote areas, I still get that feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. I don't know if it was alone out there or if there are more of them. But I do know that whatever it was stronger than any human being has a right to be, and it was intelligent enough to be, deliberate in its actions. Why am I breaking my silence now? I guess because I'm old enough that I don't care anymore about those non-disclosure agreements. Because I want someone to know the truth before I'm gone. And because I still wonder sometimes, what would have happened if my rifle hadn't jammed? Would I have killed it, or would it have killed me? I'll never know. But I do know this. There are things out there in the dark spaces of our country that science can't explain, and the government doesn't want to admit exist. I've seen one of them with my own eyes. I've felt its hands on my body, and no amount of official denial will ever change that.